After the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history, the planet enters the Triassic, a hot, unstable world where life struggles to rebuild. Strange reptiles dominate the land, the climate swings between drought and flood, and early dinosaurs first appear as small, agile survivors in a fragile ecosystem. Today we explore how this harsh era set the stage for the age of giants to come. If you enjoy calm journeys through deep time, please like, subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments, what would you ask about life in the Triassic when dinosaurs were just beginning their rise? Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. The Triassic begins after the most severe extinction event known from the rock record, and Earth is in a state of long, slow recovery. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, a very large fraction of marine species and many land vertebrate lineages disappear, leaving behind depopulated seas and simplified continental ecosystems. In the earliest Triassic interval, the basic structure of the planet's surface is already in place. The supercontinent Pangaea spans much of the globe, and a single great world ocean, Panthalassa, surrounds it. Along the eastern margin of Pangaea, between the main continental mass and a chain of smaller blocks, the Tethys region forms a broad seaway. This geography limits the moderating influence of the ocean on the interior of the continent. The continental interior climate is strongly continental, with long hot summers and cooler winters, and large regions are arid or semi-arid. Sedimentary rocks from this time commonly include red beds and evaporites, which indicate oxidized, well-drained soils, intermittent rivers, and episodes of intense evaporation. There is no clear evidence for large ice sheets, and even high-latitude regions appear to be free of long-lasting glaciation, so global conditions are best described as greenhouse rather than icehouse. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are elevated compared with many later intervals, and global average temperatures are high. In this setting, climate patterns are controlled by the contrast between the large landmass and the surrounding ocean. Strong cross-equatorial pressure gradients drive seasonal wind systems that resemble very large monsoons. During warm seasons, moist air flows onto parts of Pangaea and produces heavy rainfall along some coastal and near-coastal belts, while the distant interior remains dry for long periods. In other seasons, winds reverse or weaken, and these same regions dry out. This pattern generates sharp regional differences in water availability and produces a patchwork of climatic zones that range from strongly seasonal semi-humid belts near some coasts to hyperarid interiors where dunes and ephemeral streams dominate. Oceans at the start of the Triassic also reflect the recent crisis. In many basins, geochemical indicators and sedimentary features show that large volumes of seawater are poorly ventilated and low in dissolved oxygen, especially at depth and along some continental margins. In these low oxygen settings, typical pre-extinction reef builders and diverse bottom-dwelling invertebrate communities are rare or absent. Instead, shallow marine shelves often support widespread microbial structures known as microbialites, which form from mats of microorganisms that trap and bind sediment and precipitate carbonate. These microbial communities are abundant because they occupy ecological space left vacant by the extinction of many metazoan reef builders. Bivalves, some brachiopods and other invertebrates that tolerate warm, stressed and sometimes oxygen-poor conditions are common in many sections. But overall taxonomic diversity is low, and many regions share very similar assemblages. This low diversity and broad geographic uniformity indicate that marine ecosystems are still simplified, even though local studies show that in some places, limited recovery can occur within 1 million years or so. The contrast between local rebounds and global simplicity is a central feature of the earliest Triassic oceans. Chemical evidence from carbon and sulfur cycles, as well as from redox-sensitive trace elements, indicates that environmental conditions remain unstable. Episodes of more widespread anoxia recur during the early Triassic, interrupting recovery and removing many of the lineages that begin to diversify. As a result, ecological complexity returns slowly on the seafloor, and many benthic communities remain dominated by a small set of tolerant forms for several million years. Nectonic groups such as ammonoids recover more quickly in some regions, but this faster response does not immediately translate into fully reassembled food webs throughout the oceans. On land, the earliest Triassic landscapes are shaped by both climate stress and the biological legacy of the extinction. In many basins, soils are weakly developed and prone to erosion, and river systems shift between more stable single channels and unstable braided networks as vegetation cover changes. Pollen and plant macrofossils show that gymnosperm forests that dominated many late Permian regions are reduced or locally replaced by opportunistic plants. In some regions, spore-producing lycophytes and other disturbance-tolerant taxa dominate for a time, especially in low-lying or coastal settings, indicating that plant communities are reorganizing after the collapse of previous forests. The overall pattern is one of reduced structural complexity in vegetation, with fewer tall closed canopy forests and more open, patchy plant cover. This in turn affects soil stability hydrology and the availability of habitats for land vertebrates. Terrestrial vertebrate faunas in the earliest Triassic also show the imprint of crisis and slow recovery. In many low-latitude regions, body fossils and trackways of large tetrapods are rare, and climate models and independent evidence suggest that peak temperatures and humidity patterns may have made portions of the tropics and subtropics difficult for large active animals to inhabit for extended periods. Surviving synapsids and early archosauriform reptiles occupy refuges in more temperate or better watered regions, and their faunas are species poor compared with many late Permian assemblages. Some basins that lie in what would have been relatively wetter parts of Pangaea act as dispersal corridors, allowing surviving lineages to move and reoccupy suitable habitats over time, but the process is slow. Invertebrate communities on land also appear to have undergone a turnover, with many Paleozoic insect groups disappearing, and Triassic faunas dominated by different clades, although the fossil record across this interval contains gaps, and the exact tempo of invertebrate recovery is still under study. Across both land and sea, the earliest Triassic is therefore characterized by a combination of physical and biological factors that make conditions harsh and ecosystems fragile. High global temperatures, strong continentality, and repeated episodes of oceanic and possibly atmospheric stress limit the number of environments that can support complex communities. Where life persists or begins to diversify, it often does so in simplified systems with low species richness and limited functional variety. Recovery is not uniform. Some localities develop relatively complex assemblages within a short time, while others remain impoverished for millions of years. This unevenness reflects both regional environmental differences and the contingencies of survival and dispersal after the extinction. In this global setting, early Triassic Earth is a planet where basic physical frameworks such as continents, oceans, and climate belts are recognizable, but where the biological fabric that fills them is thinned, patchy, and still in the early stages of reconstruction. Triassic Earth presents a surface in which the main continents are joined into a single continuous landmass Pangaea, surrounded on almost all sides by one world ocean Panthalassa. Pangaea occupies a wide range of latitudes and crosses the equator, so its northern and southern sectors experience different seasonal patterns even before climate details are considered. The northern sector, often called Laurasia, includes what will later correspond to parts of North America, Europe, and Northern Asia, while the southern sector Gondwana brings together the future components of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, and parts of southern Asia. These names describe structural regions on the unified supercontinent, rather than fully separate continents in the Triassic. The outline of Pangaea is gently curved, and along its eastern margin, a broad marine embayment penetrates between the northern and southern sectors. This long seaway is the Tethys region, where oceanic water extends far into the interior of the global landmass. In paleogeographic reconstructions, the Tethys connects to Pangaea at both its western and eastern ends, but within the arc of Pangaea it forms a distinct zone with its own continental margins, island arcs and microcontinents. Some of these smaller blocks, such as parts of what will become southern Asia, occupy intermediate positions between the core of Gondwana and the northern part of Pangaea, and they define additional shallow platforms and deeper troughs along the Tethyan margin. To the outside of Pangaea, Pangaea covers most of the planetary surface. It includes deep ocean basins, long stretches of open water, and relatively few large continental blocks that rise above sea level away from the main supercontinent. This configuration limits the total length of continental shelf areas compared with times when Earth hosts several mid-sized continents. Subduction zones around much of the rim of Pangaea descend beneath the continental edges, marking the boundaries where Pangaea lithosphere moves downward into the mantle. Along some segments, these convergent margins feed volcanic arcs and uplift regions that contribute sediment to nearby basins. In other sectors, earlier mountain belts produced by Paleozoic collisions have passed their peak uplift and are in phases of erosion and crustal thinning, so the topography becomes more subdued through the Triassic, even while local ranges remain. Within the interior of Pangaea, far from any coast, sedimentary basins accumulate thick packages of continental deposits. These basins record long-term subsidence related to deep crustal processes and the combined effects of earlier tectonic loading and later extension along lines of weakness inherited from older collisions. Many are aligned parallel to ancient mountain belts, and some already show early stages of rifting that create broad depressions with stepped fault blocks. During the Triassic, these structures function mainly as wide continental lows that host rivers, ephemeral lakes, and dune fields. Because distances from these interiors to the nearest ocean are often many thousands of kilometers, air masses lose much of their moisture before reaching central regions, creating a strong geographic contrast between inland and coastal domains. The margins of Pangaea facing Pangaea form extensive coastal plains and shelf seas in some places, and narrow steep margins in others, depending on local tectonic structure. On passive-type margins where major convergence is absent, broad continental shelves extend into relatively shallow marine environments. These shelves host mixed siliciclastic and carbonate sedimentation, and they form important settings for early and middle Triassic marine ecosystems. On active margins, steep continental slopes and deep offshore basins reflect ongoing subduction and arc activity. Volcanic chains parallel to these sectors of the coast supply ash and coarse detritus to adjacent basins and add complexity to regional topography. Around the Tethys region, continental margins are more intricate. Here, a series of promontories, embayments, and smaller continental blocks create a broken outline with narrow seaways, embayed gulfs, and local microcontinents separating deeper water domains. In the early parts of the Triassic, the Tethys connects subtropical and tropical waters along much of its length, providing a long, relatively warm marine corridor between different sectors of the supercontinent. In terms of paleolatitude, many Tethyan margins lie near the equator, or within low to middle latitudes, so they become important sites for carbonate platforms and other warm water marine systems, as recovery from the end Permian crisis progresses. At higher latitudes, both in the northern and southern hemispheres, the coasts of Pangaea border Panthalassa more directly. There, the combination of cooler sea surface temperatures and the absence of large continental ice sheets during the Triassic produces conditions that are cool to temperate rather than polar in the modern sense. Fossil plant assemblages from these regions indicate that forests extend well into high latitudes, supported by the relatively mild greenhouse background state of the climate system. In some high-latitude basins, broad lowlands adjacent to the coast allow rivers to build deltas and estuaries, so terrestrial and marine sediments alternate in the stratigraphic record. Elsewhere, steep coastal relief limits the width of lowlands, and narrow, steep-sided inlets connect directly to deeper parts of Panthalassa, leaving little room for extensive coastal plains. Although the focus of this section is spatial rather than climatic, the arrangement of Pangaea, Panthalassa and the Tethys establishes strong gradients that subsequent climate patterns follow. Long cross-continental distances make interior regions sensitive to seasonal heating and cooling, while the presence of a warm low-latitude seaway within the Tethys modifies atmospheric circulation near its coasts. Combined with the limited extent of shallow epicontinental seas, this geometry constrains where extensive marine shelves, coastal wetlands and stable river networks can form. For any given region on Pangaea, the combination of paleolatitude distance from the sea and local tectonic setting controls the range of habitats that can develop and persist. It also influences how recovering Triassic ecosystems are distributed, concentrating many marine communities along the Tethyan and Panthalassan margins and confining many terrestrial habitats to belts that track water availability along coasts, rift basins and high-latitude fringes of the supercontinent. In this way, the geography of the Triassic world provides the physical framework within which environmental and biological recovery after the end Permian extinction proceeds. In the early Triassic, the atmosphere and climate of Earth are defined by a strong greenhouse background state and by the geometry of a single large continent surrounded by a global ocean. Levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide are elevated compared with many later intervals in the Mesozoic, reflecting a combination of volcanic outgassing, including activity associated with large igneous provinces near the Permian-Triassic boundary, and the reduced capacity of simplified ecosystems to store carbon efficiently. Under these conditions, global mean surface temperatures are high. Climate modelling studies that apply realistic Triassic continental configurations and estimated greenhouse gas concentrations consistently recover warm to very warm conditions across most latitudes, with especially high temperatures over the low-latitude interiors of Pangaea. The lack of permanent continental ice sheets is consistent with geological evidence, which does not show widespread glacial deposits from this time. Polar regions are cool rather than deeply cold, and high-latitude plant fossils indicate forested environments rather than treeless polar deserts. The distribution of land and sea combined with the greenhouse atmosphere produces strong seasonal and regional contrasts. Because Pangaea spans a wide range of latitudes and extends far into both hemispheres, its interior lies at great distances from any coastline. Air masses that move inland from Panthalassa or from the Tethys lose much of their moisture through precipitation before reaching the continental interior especially when they are forced to rise over coastal uplands or ancient mountain belts. As a result, vast interior regions become hot and arid, with high evaporation rates that exceed precipitation for much of the year. Sedimentary rocks from these areas often contain thick successions of red beds, Aeolian sandstones and evaporites, all consistent with semi-arid to arid climates and intermittent surface water. Climate models for early Triassic Pangaea reproduce these patterns, predicting regions of strong subsidence and clear skies over the subtropical interiors where descending limbs of large-scale circulation cells suppress cloud formation and rainfall. At the same time, the interaction between the supercontinent and the surrounding ocean generates monsoon-like circulation patterns, especially in low to middle latitudes. During warm seasons, strong differential heating between land and sea leads to low pressure over the continental interior and higher pressure over the relatively cooler ocean. Moist air flows from Pangaea and the Tethys toward the continent rising where it encounters coastal topography or convergence zones. This produces intensive seasonal rainfall along certain coastal and near-coastal belts, especially along the eastern margin of Pangaea, facing the Tethys, and in some western margin regions facing Pangaea. During cooler seasons, the temperature contrast between land and sea weakens or reverses, and winds either diminish or change direction, reducing rainfall over these areas. This alternation between wet and dry seasons, with a strong summer monsoon in some regions and prolonged dry periods at other times, leads to pronounced seasonality in surface hydrology and soil moisture. River systems in monsoon-influenced belts show evidence of variable discharge with channel deposits that record episodes of strong flow separated by intervals of low flow or even desiccation. Lakes in closed or semi-closed basins respond to fluctuating water balance, expanding during wet seasons or wetter multi-year intervals, and contracting or drying out when evaporation dominates, leaving behind evaporate minerals and desiccation cracks. Farther inland, where monsoon influence is weak or absent, rivers are fewer and more intermittent, and large dune fields accumulate where sand supply and wind conditions favour aeolian transport. These climatic gradients strongly influence the distribution of potential habitats for terrestrial life. In early Triassic, low-latitude interiors model, derived peak daytime temperatures during warm seasons can exceed levels that many large active vertebrates can tolerate for extended periods in open environments, especially when combined with limited shade and water. This helps explain the relative scarcity of diverse vertebrate assemblages in some equatorial basins, and suggests that more hospitable conditions occur at higher latitudes or near coasts, where temperatures are moderated by proximity to the ocean and by more frequent precipitation. The same models and geological indicators show that mid-latitude belts can host more moderate seasonal climates, with warm summers and cooler winters, but with a balance between rainfall and evaporation that allows more persistent surface water and vegetation. Atmospheric oxygen concentrations in the early Triassic are generally thought to be somewhat lower than in some later Mesozoic intervals, although the exact values and temporal trends are still under discussion. Geochemical proxies suggest levels that may be modestly below those of the late Paleozoic, which could further constrain the performance of large, highly active organisms, and may have influenced the structure of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. In the oceans, the combination of warm surface waters, elevated nutrient inputs from weathering and circulation patterns that reduce ventilation, in some basins favours the development of widespread low oxygen and anoxic zones, especially at depth and along certain continental margins. This interacts with atmospheric conditions because greenhouse warming tends to reduce the capacity of seawater to hold dissolved oxygen and can strengthen stratification, making it harder for oxygen-rich surface waters to mix downward. The early Triassic atmosphere also carries volcanic gases and aerosols from ongoing magmatic activity in some regions, but the dominant long-term signal is that of elevated greenhouse gases rather than short-lived cooling from individual eruptions. Weathering of continental rocks under warm, often wet conditions in some belts draws down carbon dioxide over geological timescales, but the balance between volcanic supply and weathering removal appears to maintain high greenhouse gas levels through much of the early Triassic. This prolonged warm interval delays the re-establishment of cooler, more equable climates that might support faster biotic recovery in some regions. Cloud cover patterns, storm tracks, and prevailing wind systems are all shaped by the arrangement of Pangaea and its surrounding ocean. In low-latitude Tethyan regions, sea surface temperatures are high, and evaporation is vigorous, supplying moisture to the atmosphere that fuels monsoon rains over adjacent lands when conditions are favourable. In contrast, some western margin regions that face Panthalassa may experience different combinations of upwelling coastal fog and storm activity, depending on the orientation of the coastline and the prevailing wind direction. At higher latitudes, long summer days and short winter days modulate the seasonal cycle, but the absence of extensive sea ice and the warm background state prevent extreme freezing in coastal regions. Forests at high latitudes experience strong photoperiod changes but grow under temperature regimes that remain above the thresholds for many temperate plant lineages, which is consistent with fossil evidence for diverse vegetation far from the equator. Overall, the early Triassic atmosphere and climate form a system in which high greenhouse gas concentrations, strong continentality, and monsoon dynamics combine to produce harsh and spatially variable environments. Some regions endure extended heat and aridity that limit biological complexity, while others benefit from seasonal rainfall or more moderate conditions that allow limited refuges and pathways for recovery. The interplay between these atmospheric and climatic factors and the geography of Pangaea sets the stage on which marine and terrestrial ecosystems attempt to rebuild after the end Permian extinction. In the early Triassic oceans, biological communities are still strongly shaped by the recent mass extinction, and many marine environments are occupied by so-called disaster faunas. In paleontological usage, disaster faunas are low-diversity assemblages dominated by a small number of species that tolerate stressed conditions and rapidly colonize open space after a crisis. On shallow marine shelves and in many nearshore settings, these assemblages commonly include thin-shelled bivalves, simple brachiopods, and certain foraminifers that can withstand high temperatures, variable salinity, and episodes of low oxygen. The distribution of these communities is unusually broad, so that similar sets of species occur across wide geographic regions, and taxonomic differences from place to place are modest compared with many other intervals. This homogenization of shallow marine life is one of the clearest signals that early Triassic oceans are still in a recovery state. The physical and chemical environment of the sea partly explains why disaster faunas are so widespread. Warm climate and the configuration of Pangaea encourage strong stratification in many basins, especially at low and middle latitudes. Warm, relatively fresh surface waters overlie denser, more saline deep waters, and mixing between these layers is limited. At the same time, enhanced weathering on land, driven by high temperatures and episodic intense rainfall, delivers nutrients to coastal and shelf seas. Elevated nutrient levels can increase primary productivity, but when organic matter sinks and decomposes, It consumes dissolved oxygen in subsurface waters. Geochemical records from multiple regions show that the early Triassic is marked by repeated episodes when large parts of the water column in some basins become poorly oxygenated, or even euxinic, meaning that hydrogen sulfide accumulates. These episodes coincide with fluctuations in the global carbon cycle, including large excursions in carbon isotope values, and they are particularly evident in late early Triassic intervals, such as the Smithian and the transition into the Spathian. In such conditions, many oxygen-sensitive animals struggle to survive on the seafloor, while tolerant forms persist or spread, reinforcing the dominance of disaster faunas. On the shallow sea floor, benthic communities show a clear pattern of simplification. Before the extinction, many shelves host diverse assemblages with corals, sponges, crinoids, bryozoans, and a broad range of mollusks and brachiopods, building or occupying complex three-dimensional habitats. In the earliest Triassic, these structures are largely absent in many regions. Instead, microbialites are widespread on many shallow carbonate platforms. These are sedimentary structures formed by microbial mats that trap and bind particles and induce mineral precipitation, producing mounds, domes, and layered buildups. Microbialites occupy ecological space once taken by metazoan reefs, and in some localities they build extensive constructions that fringe shorelines or cover platforms. They often coexist with simple invertebrate faunas, including small bivalves and gastropods that tolerate fluctuating conditions. In some sections, particular disaster taxa, such as certain bivalve genera, and simple foraminifers occur in dense populations for limited intervals, then decline as conditions change, indicating that these communities are opportunistic and sensitive to short-term environmental variation. Deeper parts of the shelf and upper slope show similarly reduced diversity. In many early Triassic successions, there is a prolonged absence or rarity of stenohaline taxa that usually indicate stable, well-oxygenated conditions, such as large crinoids and many articulate brachiopods. Where these groups eventually reappear in the rock record, their first abundant remains often occur higher in the succession, after beds dominated by disaster faunas and microbialites. This vertical pattern suggests that as oxygen levels and other environmental parameters become more stable, more demanding, taxa can recolonize deeper settings. Even so, detailed studies of benthic communities show that although local diversity tends to increase gradually, through the early Triassic differences between communities in different regions remain small, a sign that full biogeographic differentiation has not yet re-emerged. Pelagic and nectonic components of early Triassic marine ecosystems recover somewhat differently from benthic ones. Ammonoids, which are free-swimming, shelled cephalopods, diversify relatively quickly in several basins with new species and genera appearing within a few million years of the extinction. Their diversity, however, is accompanied by high turnover, with many short-lived forms and repeated extinction events that track environmental instability. Conodonts, small tooth-like fossils from eel-shaped vertebrates, also show complex patterns of survival and radiation, and their changes are used to define many early Triassic time intervals. Fishes and early marine reptiles begin to reoccupy nectonic roles as predators, but in the earliest Triassic their record is patchy, and only later in the period do some groups become widespread and abundant. The result is a food web in which some mid- and upper-level components are present, but not yet fully integrated with the benthic systems below. Planktonic communities, including radiolarians and other microplankton, likewise show recovery trends that vary by group and region, and their composition influences how organic matter is exported to depth, feeding benthic and microbial communities, and influencing oxygen demand in subsurface waters. The temporal pattern of marine recovery during the early Triassic is not smooth. Many sections record alternating phases of partial rebuilding and renewed stress. After the initial extinction horizon, some regions show evidence that benthic diversity and ecological complexity begin to increase within the first few million years, with more varied assemblages of invertebrates and the emergence of small metazoan-bound structures. However, negative carbon isotope excursions and geochemical markers of anoxia in the middle part of the early Triassic coincide with renewed reduction in diversity in some basins. These oscillations are particularly well expressed around the Smithian-Spathian boundary, where data from both Tethyan and Panthalassan settings indicate widespread oceanic anoxia and associated biotic crises. Each interval of expanded low oxygen conditions tends to favour the return or persistence of disaster faunas, while intervals of improved oxygenation allow more complex communities to gain ground. Over the full span of the early Triassic, the general trend is toward higher local diversity and more complex community structure, but the path is stepwise and regionally variable rather than uniformly gradual. Spatial patterns add another layer of complexity. In some shelf areas that are better ventilated or lie at higher latitudes with cooler surface waters, environmental conditions may have been more stable or less extreme, allowing earlier establishment of more diverse benthic communities. In contrast, restricted basins with limited water exchange, strong stratification, and high nutrient input tend to remain under the influence of low oxygen conditions for longer intervals, and here disaster faunas and microbialites persist as dominant components. Differences between open ocean-facing margins and more enclosed seas also matter, as do differences in subsidence rates, sediment supply, and local topography. Consequently, at any given time in the early Triassic, the global ocean includes a spectrum of settings from comparatively resilient shelves that support moderate diversity to highly stressed basins where only a narrow range of tolerant taxa thrive. Against this background, the concept of a single uniform disaster, fauna is a simplification. In practice, multiple variants exist, each shaped by local combinations of temperature, oxygen levels, salinity, and nutrient status. Nevertheless, the repeated observation that early Triassic marine communities are taxonomically simple, dominated by a small number of widely distributed tolerant species, and often associated with geochemical signs of environmental stress, supports the general characterization of early Triassic oceans as harsh and ecologically fragile. The seafloor biota can expand in diversity and complexity during intervals of improved conditions, but these gains are easily reversed by renewed episodes of anoxia or other disturbances. Only toward the end of the early Triassic do more stable patterns emerge in many regions, preparing the way for the more complex marine ecosystems that characterize the middle Triassic, while still leaving clear evidence in the rock record of the prolonged and uneven recovery that follows the end-Permian crisis. On land, in the early Triassic ecosystems reflect both the intensity of the end-Permian crisis and the constraints imposed by hot, seasonally extreme climates. Vegetation cover is reduced, and often patchy soils are weakly developed, and many basins are filled with red beds and coarse fluvial deposits that indicate frequent erosion and reworking of sediment. In regions that previously hosted extensive late Permian forests, such as those dominated by the seed fern Glossopteris, in the southern high latitudes the characteristic Permian plant assemblages disappear at or near the boundary and do not reappear. In the earliest Triassic plant fossils in many low to middle latitude basins show that gymnosperm-dominated floras are replaced or strongly reduced, and early floras are often dominated by lycophytes, particularly the quillwort-like Pangaea and related forms. These plants tolerate disturbed water-stressed environments and can colonize poorly developed substrates, so their dominance is consistent with widespread soil instability, strong seasonality, and frequent disturbance. Palynological records based on spores and pollen document a shift from diverse Permian assemblages to low diversity, early Triassic assemblages, in which a few spore types and pollen morphologies account for most of the recovered grains, indicating that the taxonomic variety of plants is reduced, and that large areas are covered by relatively uniform vegetation. In some settings, microbially induced sedimentary structures occur at the tops of beds, showing that microbial mats are common on exposed surfaces, especially in semi-arid to arid regions, where grazing and bioturbation by invertebrates and vertebrates are reduced. These microbial mats stabilize sediment locally, but also signal that higher plants and soil animals are scarce or absent on many surfaces, reinforcing the picture of simplified terrestrial ecosystems. River systems that drain early Triassic landscapes adjust to reduced vegetation and altered runoff patterns. In many basins, fluvial deposits become more dominated by braided channel and sheet flood faces, with laterally extensive sand bodies, poorly developed overbank fines, and abundant evidence for channel migration and avulsion. This style reflects high peak discharges during seasonal storms, large sediment loads from eroding uplands, and limited bank strength where root systems are sparse. In some successions, multiple stacked channel bodies with only thin floodplain intervals indicate that rivers reoccupy their own floodplains repeatedly, without long periods of soil formation or stable plant cover. Elsewhere, especially in more humid or topographically confined settings, rivers remain more laterally stable and thicker. Floodplain successions with immature paleosols and plant fossils appear, suggesting that even within the early Triassic, there are marked regional differences in the degree of landscape stability. Closed or internally drained basins host shallow lakes and ephemeral wetlands that expand and contract with monsoon cycles and longer-term climate fluctuations. Evaporite deposits such as gypsum and halite are common in some of these basins, indicating that evaporation often exceeds inflow and that salinity can rise to levels that exclude many freshwater organisms. In basins where groundwater discharge or more regular inflow sustains longer-lived water bodies, more persistent wetland vegetation develops along shorelines, and these habitats serve as refuges for both plants and animals during dry intervals. Terrestrial vertebrate faunas that occupy these landscapes are taxonomically limited and strongly dominated by a small number of surviving synapsid lineages and early archosauriform reptiles. In many southern Pangaean basins, especially in what will later become parts of South Africa and Antarctica, the herbivorous Dicynodont Lystrosaurus is the most abundant land vertebrate, and in some faunas it accounts for a large majority of recovered specimens. Its robust body, simple beak, and inferred burrowing or semi-fossorial habits have been interpreted as traits that help it persist in disturbed, seasonally stressed environments, although details of its ecology continue to be investigated. Alongside Lystrosaurus, non-mammalian cynodonts such as Thrinaxodon and Gallisaurus appear as small to medium-sized carnivores and omnivores. These therapsids show skeletal features that point toward more mammal-like physiology and behavior, including differentiated teeth and complex jaw muscles, and they occupy mid-level predator or opportunistic feeder roles in food webs, where large specialist predators are rare. Larger predatory therapsids such as many gorgonopsians and some dinocephalians do not survive into the early Triassic, and their disappearance leaves ecological space that is only gradually filled. Early archosauriforms, a group of reptiles that includes the ancestors of later crocodiles. Pterosaurs and dinosaurs are also present. Forms such as Proterosuchus and related taxa appear in some low to middle latitude basins, often interpreted as semi-aquatic or shoreline-associated predators with elongated skulls and powerful jaws. Slightly later in the early Triassic and into the early Middle Triassic, larger archosauriforms such as Erythrosuchus emerge, but in the earliest part of the period most archosauriforms are modest in diversity and occupy a subset of available predatory niches. Trackways from some early Triassic deposits indicate the presence of additional archosauriform or related diapsid reptiles whose exact affinities are constrained by footprints rather than skeletons. Amphibians, particularly temnospondyls, survive the extinction and remain important components of many river and lake margin communities. In some basins, large semi-aquatic temnospondyls occupy top predator roles in aquatic or semi-aquatic environments, preying on fishes and smaller tetrapods. Their fossils are common in fluvial and lacustrine deposits, and their distribution is often linked to belts where surface water is more consistently available. Together with small fish and invertebrates, these amphibians form the core of many freshwater food webs in the early Triassic. Terrestrial invertebrate communities are less well documented because of gaps in the insect fossil record and limited preservation of soil and leaf litter faunas. Available data suggest that many Paleozoic insect groups do not continue into the Triassic, and that modern-style insect orders become more prominent later in the period. For the early Triassic, only scattered insect fossils are known, and these provide an incomplete view of diversity and ecological structure. Nonetheless, the presence of plant damage on leaves coprolites and occasional body fossils indicates that herbivory, detritivory and predation by arthropods continue, albeit perhaps at reduced diversity and abundance compared with pre-extinction ecosystems. Invertebrate burrows in some paleosols and on some bedding surfaces show that soil-dwelling and surface-dwelling animals persist in suitable environments, though the widespread development of myths on other surfaces shows that in many regions grazing pressure is reduced enough to allow microbial mats to proliferate. Spatial patterns in early Triassic terrestrial ecosystems are pronounced. Low-latitude interior basins subject to extreme heat and aridity tend to preserve the most simplified communities with few plant taxa-limited soil development and vertebrate faunas dominated by a small number of tolerant synapsids and reptiles. In contrast, mid-latitude or high-latitude basins with more moderate temperatures and more regular precipitation can host relatively richer plant assemblages, including a mixture of lycophytes, ferns, seed ferns, and recovering gymnosperms, and they support more varied vertebrate communities with multiple herbivore and predator lineages. Some recent work suggests that riparian ecosystems along certain low-latitude rivers may also recover structural complexity relatively quickly, with trees and understory plants re-establishing along river margins even while surrounding uplands remain sparsely vegetated. These riparian zones, together with wetter high-latitude regions, function as refuges and corridors for terrestrial life, allowing surviving lineages to persist and disperse despite the overall harsh background climate. Across the early Triassic, the common features of terrestrial ecosystems are low taxonomic and structural diversity, high sensitivity to climate fluctuations, and strong geographic unevenness in recovery. Where conditions permit even modest increases in plant cover and soil development, vertebrate and invertebrate communities become more complex, but these gains are easily disrupted by renewed drought, extreme heat, or sedimentary disturbance. Land ecosystems in this interval are therefore best characterized as fragile networks of refuge, embedded within a broader landscape that is still adjusting to the combined effects of mass extinction, greenhouse climate, and reorganized hydrological systems. By the Middle Triassic, several million years have passed since the end Permian extinction, and the physical environment of Earth shows signs of greater stability, even though background conditions remain warm and recovery is incomplete. Pangaea is still assembled as a single large landmass, but its surface is modified by ongoing tectonism, erosion, and early stages of rifting in some regions. Subsiding basins along the margins of the Tethys and Panthalassa, as well as in the continental interior, accumulate thick successions of Middle Triassic sediments that record changes in climate, sea level, and sediment supply. In many areas, the proportion of fine-grained overbank deposits and more mature paleosols increases relative to the coarser red beds that dominate the earliest Triassic, indicating longer intervals of landscape stability, more persistent vegetation cover, and more organized drainage networks. Climate models that incorporate Middle Triassic boundary conditions, including adjusted greenhouse gas levels and updated paleogeography, continue to yield warm global mean temperatures, but they also show that meridional temperature gradients strengthen modestly compared with the earliest Triassic, and that some interior regions experience less extreme peak heat. Geological evidence supports this moderation. In several basins, there is a decrease in the abundance of thick evaporite sequences and widespread aeolian sandstones compared with underlying early Triassic units, and an increase in deposits that reflect perennial rivers and lakes. Paleosol profiles show better development of soil horizons, and features such as root traces, carbonate nodules, and redox mottling that reflect more stable moisture regimes and longer periods of pedosgenesis. These changes suggest that while aridity remains significant in some low-latitude interiors, the spatial extent of hyper-arid zones contracts and seasonal rainfall patterns become more regular in certain belts. Monsoon systems associated with the contrast between the large landmass of Pangaea and the surrounding ocean persist, but their effects interact with a more diversified surface, including growing vegetated belts and evolving topography. Along the Tethyan margins, warm low-latitude seas generate abundant moisture, and Middle Triassic stratigraphic records in these regions commonly show alternations between fluvial deltic and shallow marine deposits that reflect shifting shorelines and river mouth positions under the combined influence of eustatic sea level changes and local tectonics. The presence of coal and organic rich mudstones in some Middle Triassic successions indicates that in at least certain basins, waterlogged environments and dense vegetation develop conditions that are less common in the earliest Triassic. In the continental interior, some basins continue to host large ephemeral lakes and playa systems, but others shift toward more permanent lacustrine settings as catchments stabilize and basin subsidence maintains accommodation for long-lived water bodies. The distribution of climate zones across Pangaea in the Middle Triassic remains controlled by latitude and distance from the sea, but the boundaries between zones are less extreme. Low-latitude interior deserts persist, but they are flanked by semi-arid steppe-like belts and by more humid monsoon-influenced regions near coasts and along some rift basins. Mid-latitude belts, both in the northern and southern hemispheres, often exhibit warm temperate climates, with distinct seasons and sufficient precipitation to support conifer-dominated forests and mixed plant communities. High-latitude regions, especially in the southern part of Pangaea, remain free of large ice sheets and experience cool but not severe climates, allowing forests and diverse plant assemblages to extend toward the poles. This overall pattern is consistent with a greenhouse Earth, where the presence of a single supercontinent amplifies continentality but gradual reorganization of atmospheric circulation and surface processes reduces some of the most extreme conditions seen earlier. Volcanism continues in various arcs and rift-related settings, supplying gases and aerosols to the atmosphere, but there is no evidence for a Middle Triassic igneous event on the scale of the large igneous province associated with the end Permian crisis. Instead, long-term atmospheric composition reflects a balance between volcanic outgassing, organic carbon burial, and silicate weathering under warmer conditions and evolving vegetation. Some geochemical proxies suggest that carbon dioxide levels remain elevated, but may decline modestly compared with earliest Triassic peaks, contributing to the slight cooling and increased meridional temperature gradients, inferred from climate models and paleobiogeographic data. Oxygen levels likely remain lower than in some later Mesozoic intervals, but they are adequate to support increasingly active vertebrate faunas on land and in the sea. Topography in the Middle Triassic evolves under the combined influence of ongoing erosion of older mountain belts, deposition in foreland and extensional basins, and renewed uplift in some orogenic zones. As Paleozoic mountain ranges continue to wear down, sediment is redistributed into adjacent basins, building broad alluvial plains and coastal lowlands. In regions where extension is active, such as the early stages of rifting, that will eventually contribute to the breakup of Pangaea, fault-controlled basins develop with steep margins and deep depocenters. These basins often host thick continental successions that include river lake and occasionally marginal marine deposits, and they act as important repositories for Middle Triassic fossils. The combination of subsiding basins and more stable climates allows long-lived habitats to form in many of these areas, which supports more continuous ecological development than the highly disturbed early Triassic landscapes. In marine settings, Middle Triassic shelf areas along the Tethys and parts of Panthalassa show increased regional differentiation and support more complex benthic and nectonic communities, a topic addressed in more detail in later sections. From a climate and geography perspective, the key point is that the distribution and persistence of shallow marine platforms become more favourable for carbonate production and reef building in certain low to middle latitude belts, reflecting improved water quality and more stable conditions. The interplay between these marine platforms and adjacent land masses influences coastal climates. Broad shallow seas moderate temperature extremes and act as heat and moisture reservoirs, while narrow or steep margins allow more direct interaction between interior air masses and the open ocean. The overall Middle Triassic climate system remains characterized by warm temperatures, monsoon dynamics and regional aridity, but it is less dominated by the extreme heat and repeated environmental crises that mark the earliest Triassic. This partial stabilization does not mean that conditions are uniformly benign. Many regions still experience strong seasonality with pronounced wet and dry seasons, and interior basins remain vulnerable to droughts and episodic flooding. However, the increased regularity of rainfall in some belts, the development of more persistent vegetation and soils, and the presence of longer-lived lakes and wetlands provide a more consistent physical framework for ecosystems to diversify. The Middle Triassic world thus represents an intermediate stage in which Earth's geography continues to be defined by a single supercontinent and a surrounding ocean, but where climate patterns, surface processes, and basin evolution increasingly support the development of more structured and regionally distinct environments compared with the harsh and highly simplified conditions that prevailed in the earliest Triassic. In the Middle Triassic oceans, marine ecosystems show clearer signs of recovery from the end Permian crisis than in the earlier part of the period, although the process remains incomplete and regionally variable. Shallow marine shelves along the margins of the Tethys and parts of Panthalassa support more diverse benthic communities than those of the early Triassic, and the dominance of uniformly distributed disaster faunas declines. In many Tethyan and low-latitude basins, carbonate platforms are re-established or strengthened, and the composition of skeletal assemblages on these platforms becomes more varied. Bivalves, gastropods, echinoderms, and articulate brachiopods occur in more balanced proportions, and in several regions metazoan reef builders begin to occupy ecological roles that were previously filled by microbialites. Scleractinian corals, which first appear in the early to middle Triassic, are now present in some warm shallow settings. They contribute to small patch reefs or biostromes, sometimes in association with sponges and other invertebrates. These early coral reefs are not yet as extensive or as taxonomically rich as later Mesozoic reef systems, but their presence indicates that environmental conditions on certain shelves have become sufficiently stable, clear and well oxygenated to permit persistent reef building. Microbialites do not vanish, but in many sections they retreat to specific settings or coexist with metazoan-bound structures, rather than dominating entire platforms as in parts of the early Triassic. On open shelves, benthic communities include crinoids, ophiuroids, other echinoderms, and a broader range of mollusks than before. Articulate brachiopods recover in several regions, although they rarely regain the global ecological prominence they had in the Paleozoic. Tiering within benthic communities becomes more complex, with infaunal, epifaunal and semi-infaunal organisms exploiting different depths and substrate types. Bioturbation intensity in sediments increases as burrowing invertebrates become more common, and trace fossil assemblages shift from simple horizontal trails and limited vertical burrows to more diverse suites that indicate deeper and more frequent sediment mixing. These patterns suggest that oxygen penetration into the substrate improves, and that benthic food webs incorporate a wider range of feeding strategies, including suspension feeding, deposit feeding, grazing, and predation. In the upper parts of continental slopes and in offshore basins, the prevalence of anoxic and euxinic conditions declines in many regions compared with the early Triassic, though it does not disappear entirely. Geochemical records and sedimentological observations indicate that low oxygen events still occur, especially in restricted basins, or during intervals of climatic or oceanographic disturbance, but they are less persistent on a global scale. In sections that span the early to middle Triassic transition, black shales and laminated low bioturbation faces that dominate parts of the earlier interval give way upward to more bioturbated mudstones and siltstones containing a wider range of benthic fossils. This vertical change reflects improved ventilation of bottom waters and a reduction in the frequency or duration of severe anoxic episodes. Nevertheless, deep basins remain sensitive to changes in stratification, and nutrient input and local or regional anoxic events can still suppress benthic diversity. The pelagic and nectonic components of Middle Triassic marine ecosystems diversify substantially. Ammonoids continue to play an important role as widely distributed cephalopod predators and prey, and their taxonomic richness increases through the Middle Triassic, with multiple families and genera occupying different ecological niches. Their shells appear in a variety of shapes, from simple coiled forms to more compressed or ornamented morphologies, and their biogeographic patterns show stronger differentiation among provinces than in the early Triassic. Conodont faunas also diversify, and their biozones provide a refined temporal framework for Middle Triassic marine successions. Radiolarian assemblages in open ocean settings develop greater diversity and regional structure, indicating that planktonic communities have moved beyond the simplest post-extinction states. These changes in pelagic microfaunas influence the efficiency and spatial distribution of organic matter flux to the deep sea, affecting oxygen demand and nutrient recycling in the water column and at the sea floor. One of the most conspicuous features of Middle Triassic seas is the radiation of marine reptiles. Ichthyosaurs, which appear in the early Triassic, become more diverse and specialized. Early Middle Triassic ichthyosaurs include medium to large forms with streamlined bodies adapted for active swimming in the open ocean. Their dentitions range from slender fish-eating types to more robust morphologies that may be suited to crushing hard-shelled prey. Their fossil remains, including articulated skeletons and gut contents, in some cases indicate that they occupy roles as high-level predators in pelagic food webs. Nothosauroids and related sauropterygians establish themselves in coastal and shallow marine environments. These reptiles often have elongate bodies and limbs modified into paddles, and many are interpreted as semi-aquatic animals that feed on fishes and invertebrates, along continental shelves and in nearshore waters. Placodonts, another group of marine reptiles, evolve robust skulls and teeth adapted for crushing hard-shelled prey, and some develop broad-armoured bodies. They specialize in feeding on bivalves and other shelly invertebrates in shallow marine habitats, linking the diversification of marine reptiles to the rebuilding of benthic communities. Together, these reptile groups contribute to a more complex trophic structure in Middle Triassic seas, with multiple predator guilds occupying different parts of the water column and coastal zones. Fishes also diversify, with both cartilaginous and bony fishes occupying a range of ecological roles. Actinopterygian fishes, including early relatives of several later Mesozoic lineages, become more abundant and varied in form. Their remains occur in both nearshore and offshore deposits, and they fill roles as planktivores, benthic feeders, and mid-level predators. Hybodont sharks and other chondrichthyans contribute to predation on fishes and invertebrates. As a result, food webs in many Middle Triassic marine environments exhibit several trophic levels, from primary producers and planktonic grazers up through invertebrate and vertebrate consumers to large reptilian and fish predators. Primary production in Middle Triassic oceans involves a range of phytoplankton groups. Calcareous nanoplankton are not yet prominent, but other algal and cyanobacterial groups contribute to primary productivity. In some shallow settings, especially on carbonate platforms, benthic algae and microbial communities remain important contributors to carbon fixation, while in open ocean waters, planktonic producers form the base of pelagic food webs. The structure of the plankton, though less well known than in later intervals, is sufficiently complex to sustain diverse zooplankton and nekton populations. Regional patterns in Middle Triassic marine ecosystems are influenced by latitude basin geometry and proximity to land. In low latitude Tethyan shelves, warm waters, high light levels, and suitable substrate conditions promote carbonate production and reef growth. Here coral and sponge reefs, carbonate sand shoals, and associated lagoonal and forereef environments host diverse assemblages of invertebrates and fishes. In mid-latitude settings, cooler temperatures and different nutrient regimes favour mixed siliciclastic and carbonate systems with somewhat different faunal compositions. High-latitude shelves, where daylight and temperature regimes differ, host communities adapted to cooler conditions, though they still operate within an overall greenhouse climate without extensive sea ice. Along some passive margins, broad shelves provide ample space for these communities to expand, while along active margins and in narrow basins, steep slopes and strong gradients constrain the extent of shallow habitats. Despite the overall progress in recovery, Middle Triassic marine ecosystems remain vulnerable to environmental stress. Changes in sea level tectonic activity or climate can fragment habitats, alter circulation, and shift nutrient supply, leading to local or regional declines in diversity. Some intervals within the Middle Triassic record disturbances, including smaller-scale extinction or turnover events, though none approach the magnitude of the end-Permian crisis. In addition, the build-up of complex, highly specialized faunas is still in progress. Many clades that will dominate later Mesozoic seas are only beginning to diversify, and ecological roles may be filled by relatively generalist taxa. Even so, compared with the early Triassic, Middle Triassic marine ecosystems, exhibit higher taxonomic richness, stronger provincial differentiation, clearer reef development, and better integrated food webs. Ocean environments are still shaped by warm greenhouse conditions and by the configuration of Pangaea and its surrounding ocean. But the combination of improved oxygenation in many basins, stabilized climate patterns in some regions, and the diversification of invertebrates, fishes, and marine reptiles allows marine communities to move beyond the homogenized disaster assemblages of the earliest Triassic toward more structured and resilient systems, although they remain less complex than those of later periods. By the Middle Triassic on land, the combined effects of a more moderate but still warm climate, reorganized drainage systems, and recovering plant communities produce terrestrial ecosystems that are more structured than those of the earliest Triassic, although diversity remains uneven, and many assemblages are sensitive to climatic variation. In many low to middle latitude basins along the margins of the Tethys and Panthalassa river systems, shift from highly unstable braided styles toward more mixed patterns that include single-channel and anastomosing reaches bounded by better developed floodplains. Overbank deposits become more common and contain thicker packages of fine-grained sediments, with paleosols that preserve root traces, pedogenic carbonate nodules, and other indicators of longer intervals of landscape stability. Coal seams, organic rich mudstones, and peat horizons appear in some Middle Triassic successions, especially in coastal and paralic settings, showing that permanently wet or frequently waterlogged conditions support dense vegetation in certain regions. These developments reflect both climatic moderation and the progressive return of complex plant cover. Plant macrofossils and pollen from Middle Triassic strata indicate that gymnosperms have re-established themselves as major components of many floras. Conifers with needle-like or scale-like leaves dominate numerous assemblages, particularly in mid-latitude belts, where warm temperate climates and reliable precipitation favour forest growth. Other seed plants, including cycads, ginkgophytes, and seed ferns, occur alongside conifers, contributing to canopy and sub-canopy layers and to the structure of riparian thickets. Ferns and horsetails occupy understory and wet ground habitats, especially along river margins in floodplain depressions and around lake shores. Lycophytes remain important in some disturbed or wetland settings, but no longer dominate as they did in many earliest Triassic floras. Palynological records show an increase in the diversity and evenness of spore and pollen types, compared with the earliest Triassic, with a broader range of gymnosperm pollen grains and fern spores represented, and this pattern is consistent with more complex vegetation structure. Regional differences are marked. In some Tethyan margin basins, Middle Triassic plant assemblages include rich associations of conifers and cycads that indicate evergreen or seasonally deciduous forests with relatively high biomass. In contrast, some continental interior basins still preserve floras dominated by drought-tolerant conifers, seed ferns, and sparse understory plants adapted to semi-arid conditions and strong seasonality and rainfall. High-latitude regions of southern Pangaea, where daylight seasonality is strong but temperatures remain moderate, host mixed forests, that include conifers, seed ferns, and various pteridophytes, and these forests extend close to the poles under greenhouse conditions. Across these settings, the presence of trees with deep and extensive root systems enhances soil development and bank stability, which in turn influences river morphology and floodplain dynamics. River valleys in Middle Triassic basins act as important ecological corridors that concentrate water nutrients and vegetation. Along many river systems, riparian forests with conifers and other gymnosperms overlie understories of ferns, horsetails, and shade-tolerant shrubs. Fallen wood leaf litter and organic-rich soils follow channel margins and low terraces, providing habitats for invertebrates and small vertebrates. Floodplains host a mosaic of habitats including levees with well-drained soils, bearing open woodlands, back swamps with fine-grained sediments and standing water that support wetland plants, and more elevated interfluves with drier soils and more open vegetation. Seasonal floods redistribute sediment and nutrients across these surfaces, sometimes damaging vegetation but also creating new colonization sites. Away from the main river corridors, upland basins and gently sloping plateaus carry more open woodlands and shrublands. In semi-arid regions, woodland patches of drought-tolerant conifers and seed ferns are separated by areas of low herbaceous cover and bare ground, while in more humid regions, uplands carry closed canopy forests with thicker soils. Volcanic highlands and residual Paleozoic mountain belts support locally cooler and wetter microclimates, where plant assemblages differ from those of surrounding lowlands. These upland habitats contribute to regional heterogeneity and may act as refuges for moisture-dependent taxa during warmer or drier intervals. Terrestrial vertebrate faunas in the Middle Triassic respond to this diversified physical template. Non-mammalian synapsids persist, although their diversity patterns vary across regions. Large herbivorous dicynodonts of the Pangaea group are present in several Middle Triassic faunas, particularly in parts of Gondwana, where they browse on foliage in floodplain and lowland settings. Cynodonts become more diverse with herbivorous or omnivorous traverse-dontid forms present in some mid-latitude basins, and smaller insectivorous or carnivorous taxa occupying a range of niches. These therapsids show advanced jaw and tooth specializations, including complex post-canine teeth suited to processing plant material or mixed diets, and their distribution suggests that they are important components of Middle Triassic food webs. Amphibians, especially temnospondyls, remain abundant and ecologically significant in many river and lake margin environments. Large Capitosaurian and Trematosaurian temnospondyls act as top or near-top aquatic predators, in some basins preying on fishes and smaller tetrapods. Their fossils occur in channel fills, overbank deposits and lacustrine sediments, indicating that they inhabit a range of freshwater settings from main channels to floodplain ponds. Smaller temnospondyls occupy more marginal or ephemeral aquatic habitats and may follow shifting water bodies across floodplains as seasons change. The life histories of these amphibians inferred from bone histology and growth patterns include both aquatic juvenile stages and more terrestrial adults in some taxa, tying their population dynamics closely to the persistence of surface water in a climate with pronounced seasonality. Archosauriform reptiles diversify substantially during the Middle Triassic. Early stem archosaurs and related diapsids occupy both terrestrial and semi-aquatic roles. In many basins, medium to large predators with elongated skulls and upright or semi-upright limb postures appear in the fossil record, including forms related to Rauisuchians, Poposauroids, and other early archosaur clades. These animals hunt along river margins, floodplains, and in some coastal environments feeding on dicynodonts. coenodonts, smaller reptiles and amphibians. Their limb structure and trackways indicate more erect or pillar-like limb postures, compared with many earlier reptiles, which likely allows more efficient locomotion on land and supports active pursuit predation in open habitats. Other archosauriforms evolve more specialized diets or modes of life. Some early pseudosutian lineages show adaptations to semi-aquatic ambush predation, while small insectivorous or omnivorous forms exploit leaf litter and understory habitats. Ornithodyrran lineages that will later give rise to pterosaurs and dinosaurs begin to diversify in the Middle Triassic, but during this interval they remain minor components of most known assemblages, represented by small, lightly built forms that occupy limited ecological space relative to other archosaurs and synapsids. Invertebrate communities on land and in fresh water also become more varied. Insects diversify in both taxonomic composition and ecological roles, although the record remains incomplete and uneven by region. Evidence from leaf damage coprolites and rare body fossils points to the presence of a range of herbivorous, detritivorous, and predatory insects in forest canopies, understories, and along water margins. Crustaceans, mollusks, and other invertebrates inhabit lakes, rivers, and wetlands, contributing to detrital processing and serving as prey for fishes and amphibians. Burrowing invertebrates are reflected in more complex ichno-fossil assemblages in floodplain and lacustrine sediments, consistent with deeper and more frequent bioturbation than in many earliest Triassic deposits. Despite this increase in ecological complexity, Middle Triassic terrestrial ecosystems remain sensitive to climatic and environmental fluctuations. In some regions, sedimentary records show repeated alternations between more humid phases with coal formation and extensive paleosols and more arid phases marked by increased evaporate deposition or aeolian sandstones. These cycles affect vegetation cover, water availability, and the distribution of habitats, leading to shifts in the composition and structure of plant and animal communities over time. Biogeographic analyses indicate that terrestrial faunas become more provincial, with distinct assemblages in different parts of Pangaea that reflect both climatic gradients and physical barriers, such as mountain belts and long dry corridors. At the same time, total global diversity of non-marine tetrapods remains below that of many later Mesozoic intervals, and some clades that expand regionally do so into ecosystems that still have relatively simple food webs compared with those that will develop later in the Triassic. Overall, Middle Triassic rivers, forests, and uplands represent an intermediate stage in terrestrial recovery, in which conifer-dominated forest-structured floodplains and diversified vertebrate and invertebrate faunas coexist with continued climatic stress, pronounced regional differences in ecosystems that can still be disrupted by shifts in water balance and temperature over geological and ecological timescales. In the early late Triassic, Earth remains in a greenhouse state with Pangaea still assembled, but the climate and landscapes begin to show new patterns, superimposed on the long-term background of warmth and general aridity. The late Triassic as a whole is characterized by hot, seasonally extreme conditions across many low-latitude interiors, with extensive semi-arid and arid belts, and strong monsoon systems driven by the contrast between the large continent and the surrounding global ocean. However, within this framework, the earliest part of the late Triassic, the Carnian stage, includes a well-documented interval of increased humidity and intensified hydrological cycling that stands out against the drier baseline. This interval, often termed the Carnian humid episode, represents a shift from predominantly arid conditions to more humid climates in many basins, and then a return to more arid states. Geological evidence for this episode comes from multiple lines of data. In terrestrial and marginal marine successions, coarser siliciclastic sediments and increased proportions of sandstones and mudstones derived from continental erosion indicate enhanced runoff from land into basins. In some areas, paleosols with features characteristic of humid climates, including organic-rich horizons and leached profiles, appear within Carnian successions, contrasting with the more weakly developed evaporation-influenced soils above and below. Coal seams and other organic-rich deposits also become more common in some Tethyan and extra-Tethyan basins, during this time implying the establishment of waterlogged environments and dense vegetation under wetter conditions. In marine records, shifts in sediment composition and faunal changes point to increased freshwater input and altered nutrient delivery to coastal seas. Stable isotope data, particularly carbon and oxygen isotope excursions, indicate perturbations to the global carbon cycle and changes in temperature and rainfall patterns that coincide with this humid interval. The duration of the humid phase is constrained to a few million years within the early Carnian, after which many regions record a return to more arid or strongly seasonal conditions, though exact timings can vary from basin to basin. The causes of this early-late Triassic humid interval are still the subject of active research, but many studies link it to large-scale volcanic activity in the form of a large igneous province in what is now Western North America, often referred to as the Wrangellia province. Flood basalt eruptions associated with this province release substantial amounts of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide as well as aerosols and other volatiles, into the atmosphere. Geochronological and stratigraphic data suggest that the main eruptive phases broadly overlap with the timing of the Carnian humid episode. Carbon cycle modelling and isotope records indicate that pulses of volcanic outgassing could drive rapid warming and intensify the hydrological cycle, increasing global humidity and strengthening monsoon systems. At the same time, enhanced weathering of volcanic and continental rocks under warmer, wetter conditions would draw down carbon dioxide over longer timescales, contributing to subsequent cooling or a partial return toward more arid climates once eruptive activity wanes. The exact magnitude and spatial pattern of these effects remain uncertain, and not all basins record identical responses, but the association between large-scale volcanism, carbon cycle disturbance and climatic shifts in the early-late Triassic is supported by current data. Superimposed on these short to medium duration events are longer-term climatic oscillations during the late Triassic. Climate reconstructions based on sedimentary faces, paleosols, fossil assemblages and geochemical proxies indicate that after the humid Carnian interval, cooler conditions develop in parts of the early Nourian, followed by later intervals of renewed warmth, all within an overall greenhouse framework. These changes alter temperature gradients between low and high latitudes and affect the strength and position of monsoon belts. In some regions, evidence points to expansion of wetlands and reduction in the area of desert climates during particular intervals, while at other times arid belts re-expand. Orbital forcing, including variations in Earth's eccentricity, obliquity and precession, appears to modulate rainfall patterns on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, producing cyclic alternations of more humid and more arid phases that are recorded in lacustrine and fluvial successions. Over longer timescales, the interplay between volcanic outgassing, weathering, and organic carbon burial shapes the background levels of greenhouse gases and the mean climate state within which these shorter-term oscillations occur. The surface expression of these climatic patterns in the early-late Triassic is a set of landscapes that differ in important respects from those of the earliest Triassic, while retaining some of the same broad features. Interior parts of Pangaea continue to host extensive deserts and semi-arid regions with dune fields, ephemeral rivers, and closed basins that accumulate evaporates during dry phases. However, around the margins of the supercontinent and within developing rift systems, more humid intervals promote the growth of extensive river networks, deltas and lakes. Extensional tectonics associated with the initial stages of Pangaea's breakup create elongated rift basins along several continental margins, particularly in what will later become the central Atlantic region and parts of western Gondwana. These basins form half-graben and full-graben structures with steep fault-controlled margins and relatively flat floors, providing accommodation space for thick continental successions. Within many of these rift basins, alternating packages of fluvial deltic and lacustrine sediments preserve detailed records of changing water balance and sediment supply. Lake deposits in some early late Triassic rift basins show rhythmic alternations of deeper water and shallower or more evaporitic faces that correspond to changes in monsoon intensity and effective precipitation, likely driven by orbital forcing. Geochemical and mineralogical proxies such as variations in hematite content or organic matter, preservation track shifts in redox conditions and lake level through time and support. The interpretation that monsoonal rainfall over adjacent highlands waxes and wanes over multi-million-year intervals. In basins where humidity increases during the Carnian episode, thick successions of fine-grained lacustrine mudstones accumulate, sometimes interbedded with coarser delta front and channel deposits that represent phases of enhanced runoff. As climate returns toward more arid conditions, these lacustrine sequences may grade upward into more evaporitic facies or into dominantly fluvial successions with evidence of reduced lake size and more intermittent flow. Coastal regions in the early late Triassic also respond to these climatic and tectonic changes. Along the Tethyan margins, relative sea level fluctuations driven by a combination of eustatic changes and subsidence or uplift associated with tectonism cause shorelines to migrate landward and seaward over time. During more humid intervals, increased sediment supply from rivers can build broad deltas and coastal plains, while in drier phases reduced runoff and heightened evaporation promote the development of Sabkar-like environments and restricted lagoons. In some sectors, carbonate platforms that developed during the Middle Triassic continue to grow, but their facies architectures record changes in water depth, nutrient input and terrigenous influx linked to shifts in climate and hinterland erosion. Around volcanic provinces and uplifted regions, local topographic relief and fresh volcanic substrates influence runoff patterns, sediment geochemistry and soil development, further diversifying early late Triassic landscapes. High-latitude regions, particularly in the southern part of Pangaea, remain relatively cool compared with low latitudes but continue to experience ice-free conditions and forested environments. Here, changes in precipitation and temperature during the early late Triassic modify the extent and composition of forests and the distribution of wetlands and river systems, but the basic pattern of temperate, seasonally light-limited ecosystems persists. Taken together, the climate and landscapes of the early late Triassic are characterized by a combination of persistent greenhouse warmth, strong seasonality, and a generally arid background state punctuated and locally reshaped by intervals of increased humidity linked to volcanic activity and carbon cycle disturbance, and by the ongoing development of rift basins and dynamic coastal systems. These factors create a physically complex world in which hydrological regimes, sedimentary environments, and the spatial distribution of habitats change over both short and long time scales, while the supercontinent framework of Pangaea and the surrounding world ocean continue to control the broad pattern of climate zones and environmental gradients across the planet. In the late Triassic lowlands, broad river plains, deltas, coastal wetlands, and seasonal lakes form a connected set of environments that respond directly to the warm, greenhouse climate, strong seasonality, and variable humidity described for this interval. These settings develop on the subsiding margins of Pangaea, along the coasts of the Tethys and Panthalassa, and within elongate rift basins that open as the supercontinent begins to extend. Across these regions, the balance between rainfall and evaporation, controlled by monsoon systems and longer-term climatic oscillations, determines whether rivers flow persistently or intermittently, whether lakes are perennial or seasonal, and whether lowlands support stable wetlands and peat accumulation, or instead host evaporitic playas and sparsely vegetated floodplains. On many late Triassic river plains, large drainage systems collect runoff from uplands and transport sediment toward interior basins or coastal margins. Stratigraphic successions in several rift basins and foreland basins record thick packages of fluvial sandstones and mudstones that document the behavior of these rivers over millions of years. In humid or seasonally humid intervals, channels with mixed patterns including single-thread and multi-thread reaches are flanked by extensive overbank deposits. These overbank intervals contain fine-grained sediments with paleosols of varying maturity root traces and plant remains indicating that floodplains support persistent vegetation and soils that develop over repeated flood cycles. In more arid phases, channel belts dominated by red sandstones and conglomerates alternate with thinner, less developed floodplain units, and features such as calcrete horizons and desiccation cracks show that soils experience strong drying between infrequent floods. In some rift basins, stacked fluvial cycles document repeated shifts between episodes of higher discharge and more stable channels, and episodes of reduced flow, greater channel mobility, and increased aeolian reworking of exposed sediment. Where rivers enter standing water bodies, they construct deltas and alluvial plains that grade into coastal or lacustrine environments. In the early late Triassic, this style of deposition is well developed in both marine margin and non-marine basins. Along some Tethyan margins, shallow marine shelves receive large volumes of siliciclastic sediment from river systems forming broad deltas that prograde into coastal seas. Core and outcrop studies from basins such as the North Carnarvon Basin provide detailed facies models in which shallow water braided deltas, mouth bars, and delta front sands pass landward into distributary channels and floodplain deposits that locally contain coal seams. These coal-bearing intervals indicate that in certain intervals and regions, coastal plains and lower river courses support waterlogged vegetated wetlands for long enough to accumulate significant peat before burial. Seaward delta fronts pass into prodelta muds and shallow marine sands that record the interaction between river-derived sediment and waves tides and storm currents. In non-marine rift basins, fluvial systems deliver sediment to lakes whose size and depth vary with climate and subsidence. Well-studied late Triassic rift successions, such as those in the Newark supergroup of eastern North America, preserve transitions from alluvial fan and braided river deposits near basin margins to extensive fluvial and deltic sandstones and finer-grained lacustrine mudstones in basin centers. In these settings, repeated alternations between thick lake mudstone packages and more sand-rich intervals reflect changes in lake level, driven by variations in precipitation and evaporation. During phases of relatively high effective moisture, lakes deepen and expand, and deltas prograde into deeper water, building downstepping or upstepping cliniforms, depending on the balance between accommodation and sediment supply. During drier phases, lake levels fall, shorelines retreat, and deltas incise and shift, leaving behind stacked shallow water or marginal faces. Cyclic alternations of deeper lacustrine and shallower, sometimes evaporitic faces in these basins are consistent with orbitally paced monsoon variability, superimposed on longer-term climatic trends. Wetlands and peat-forming environments develop wherever water tables remain close to the land surface for extended periods, and plant productivity and preservation conditions allow organic matter to accumulate. In the late Triassic, these settings occur both in coastal lowlands and in inland basins that experience more humid conditions, particularly during the Carnian humid episode and in other wetter intervals. Fossil coal seams and organic-rich mudstones from various late Triassic formations indicate that swamps and marshes dominated by gymnosperms, ferns, horsetails and other plants occupy floodplains, back swamps behind natural levees, and low-lying coastal plains. Palynological assemblages from some Carnian to early Norian successions show increases in hygrophytic spores and pollen, consistent with the expansion of moisture requiring plant communities in these wetlands during humid phases. When climate shifts toward more arid conditions, the areal extent of wetlands contracts, coal formation diminishes, and organic-rich deposits give way to oxidized mudstones and evaporates. Seasonal lakes and playa systems are common in many late Triassic interiors and rift basins, where evaporation can seasonally exceed inflow. These basins accumulate lacustrine deposits that range from laminated organic-rich mudstones formed in relatively deep stratified lakes to massive mudstones and evaporate-rich layers formed on shallow saline flats. In deeper lake phases, bottom waters can become poorly oxygenated, and fine lamination with limited bioturbation is preserved. This favours the accumulation of organic matter and can generate source rocks under suitable conditions. When climate becomes drier or monsoon intensity weakens, lake levels drop, shallow shore face and delta front facies shift. Basinward and exposed mudflats may undergo pedogenesis erosion or evaporate crystallization. Repeated cycles of lake expansion and contraction, recorded in facies successions and geochemical proxies, show that these systems are sensitive to relatively small changes in the balance between rainfall runoff and evaporation. From a habitat perspective, perennial lakes provide stable aquatic environments for fishes, invertebrates and amphibians, while seasonal lakes and playas offer only intermittent resources and require organisms to cope with rapid changes in water availability and chemistry. Along marine coastlines, late Triassic shore zones include tidal flats, lagoons, estuaries and other marginal marine wetlands that occupy the interface between terrestrial and marine realms. In many Tethyan sectors, carbonate platforms developed during the Middle Triassic continue into the Late Triassic, but their margins are fringed and locally overlain by siliciclastic deposits, derived from rivers, especially during humid intervals when runoff increases. In these mixed systems, estuarine channels host brackish water faunas, and muddy tidal flats support burrowing invertebrates adapted to fluctuating salinity and periodic exposure. Coastal marsh, like environments while not built by angiosperm, dominated vegetation, as in later periods are established by tolerant conifers, seed ferns and spore plants that can occupy periodically flooded and saline-influenced substrates. Where relative sea level falls or sediment supply outpaces accommodation, coastal plains widen, and rivers in size temporarily stabilizing shorelines. Where sea level rises or subsidence accelerates shorelines, migrate landward and coastal wetlands and deltas shift into areas previously on land. Fire drought and floods contribute to disturbance regimes in late Triassic lowlands and coasts. Charcoal in some late Triassic terrestrial and transitional deposits provides direct evidence that wildfires occur in vegetated regions, especially during dry seasons or dry phases within longer humid intervals. Fire can remove plant cover from floodplains and slopes, increasing sediment yield to rivers and lakes and temporarily reducing habitat complexity. Major floods driven by intense monsoon rains or storm events redistribute sediment across floodplains over top levees and scour channels, locally removing soils and vegetation, while also creating new bars and splays that plants can colonize. Prolonged drought reduces river discharge, shrinks lakes and wetlands, and concentrates solutes in remaining water bodies, stressing aquatic and wetland organisms. The combination of these disturbances with strong climatic seasonality means that many late Triassic floodplains, deltas and wetlands are maintained in states where community structure and physical configuration can change over relatively short timescales. Spatial patterns in these environments reflect gradients in climate tectonic setting and proximity to the sea. Low-latitude interior basins under persistent aridity tend to be dominated by ephemeral rivers, thin or absent wetlands and playa lakes, and their stratigraphic records emphasize redbeds, calcretes and evaporites. Marginal basins that experience stronger monsoon influence and more frequent humid phases preserve thicker successions of fine-grained floodplain deposits, lacustrine mudstones and coal, indicating more extensive and longer-lived wetlands and lakes. Along Tethyan and Panthalassan coasts, combinations of river-dominated deltas, tide-influenced estuaries and carbonate platforms generate complex mosaics of habitats, with transitions between fluvial, lagoonal, and open marine settings over distances of a few kilometres. Across all these settings, late Triassic floodplains, coasts and wetlands remain shaped by greenhouse warmth, strong seasonal contrasts and episodes of climatic perturbation. They provide key habitats and corridors for plants and animals that persist and diversify during the late Triassic, but they also remain sensitive to shifts in water balance, sediment supply and sea level, so that their distribution and internal structure change repeatedly over the course of the period. Archosaurs in the Triassic are a clade of diapsid reptiles defined as the group that includes the most recent common ancestor of crocodiles and birds, and all of its descendants, and in this period they diversify into many lineages that share the land with surviving synapsids and other reptile groups. In modern taxonomy, archosaurs are divided into two major branches, pseudosuchians or crocodile line archosaurs and avimetatarsalians or bird line archosaurs, the latter including dinosaurs and pterosaurs. During the Triassic, these branches explore a wide range of body sizes and ecological roles against the background of warm greenhouse climates, strongly seasonal rainfall and landscapes that often remain structurally simple and vulnerable to disturbance. In early and middle Triassic assemblages, pseudosuchians and their close relatives are abundant components of many faunas, and by the late Triassic they are joined by the first pterosaurs and by early true dinosaurs, while non-mammalian synapsids continue to occupy herbivore and small predator roles in many regions. The result is a set of ecosystems in which no single clade dominates all environments, and where ecological space is partitioned among multiple archosaur and synapsid lineages that respond in different ways to climatic and environmental constraints. Pseudosuchians in the late Triassic include several distinct groups that are often convergent with later crocodilians, or with large predatory dinosaurs in overall body form even though they belong to a different branch of the archosaur tree. Phytosaurs are long-snouted semi-aquatic predators that resemble crocodiles superficially but differ in details of skull and ankle structure. Their fossils are common in fluvial and lacustrine deposits, from low-latitude to mid-latitude basins, and they occupy top predator positions in many river and lake systems, feeding on fishes and terrestrial vertebrates that enter the water. Etosaurs, in contrast, are heavily armoured, primarily herbivorous or omnivorous pseudosuchians, with broad bodies and dorsal bony plates. They occur widely in late Triassic terrestrial deposits, especially in floodplain and upland settings, and their limb and skull anatomy suggests that they browse low vegetation and disturb soils while foraging, influencing plant communities and sediment structure. Large erect-limbed Rauisuchians and related taxa function as apex predators on land in many faunas. These animals have deep skulls with powerful jaws, proportionally long hind limbs, and pelvic structures that support an upright posture, allowing efficient locomotion over open ground. Fossils of Rauisuchians and similar crocodile line archosaurs appear in late Triassic formations on several continents, and trackways and bone beds indicate that they hunt large herbivorous synapsids, smaller archosaurs and other vertebrates on floodplains and in uplands. Basal crocodilomorphs also appear by the late Triassic, initially as relatively small lightly built forms that occupy more specialized ecological roles, but their later history lies outside the scope of this Triassic-focused account. Birdline archosaurs in the Triassic include pterosaurs and dinosaurs, but for much of the period they are not the numerically dominant components of most faunas. Pterosaurs first appear in the fossil record in the middle of the late Triassic, in formations from Europe, South America, and later North America, where small individuals such as those from Petrified Forest National Park are associated with river and floodplain deposits. Their skeletons show elongated forelimbs with a greatly lengthened fourth finger, supporting a wing membrane, hollow bones, and light skulls, features associated with powered flight in open air. Early pterosaurs are small to medium-sized animals that likely forage over coastal zones, river corridors, and lakes, feeding on insects, small vertebrates, and fish. Their presence adds an aerial layer to Triassic ecosystems, linking aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric habitats through their movements and feeding. The earliest unequivocal dinosaurs, including small bipedal forms such as early theropods and basal sauropodomorphs, appear in middle to late Triassic deposits, particularly in South America and later in other regions of Pangaea. In the late Triassic, dinosaurs occupy a subset of available climatic and environmental space. Analyses of their distributions indicate that some early sauropodomorphs preferentially occur in relatively humid mid-latitude environments and are less common in the driest low-latitude interior basins. Within their preferred ranges, these dinosaurs function as medium-sized herbivores or omnivores on floodplains and in open woodlands, coexisting with dacynodonts, etosaurs, and other herbivores. Small theropod dinosaurs act as agile predators or scavengers, feeding on vertebrates and large invertebrates. In most well-studied late Triassic assemblages, however, dinosaurs remain less abundant and less diverse than pseudosuchian archosaurs, which retain many major predator and herbivore roles. Non-mammalian synapsids continue to be important in late Triassic terrestrial ecosystems, particularly as herbivores and as small to medium predators. Large canamyriform dicynodonts such as Placharius represent some of the last megaherbivorous synapsids. They occupy lowland and floodplain habitats, browsing on conifers, seed ferns, and other plants near water sources. Their robust bodies and limb structures indicate that they can traverse soft substrates, and their presence in multiple late Triassic formations on different continents shows that they remain widespread until late in the period. Cynodonts diversify into several lineages, including traversodontids and probaenognathians, which adopt herbivorous, omnivorous, or carnivorous diets. Herbivorous traversodontids possess complex cheek teeth, adapted for grinding plant material, and likely exploit understory vegetation in forests and along river margins. Small carnivorous or insectivorous cynodonts have slender jaws and teeth, suited to capturing small prey, and their skeletal anatomy suggests more agile mammal-like locomotion and more active metabolisms. Some of these probaenognathian cynodonts give rise to the earliest mammalia forms, which appear in the late Triassic as very small, mostly insectivorous animals that occupy nocturnal or otherwise cryptic niches. The coexistence of archosaurs and synapsids in late Triassic ecosystems produces food webs in which multiple clades share similar broad roles, but partition them along gradients of body size, microhabitat, and climate. Large carnivore positions in many faunas are occupied by Rauisuchians on land and by phytosaurs in water, with smaller terrestrial predators, including early theropod dinosaurs, crocodilomorphs, and predatory cynodonts. Herbivore guilds combine dicynodonts, etosaurs, early sauropodomorph dinosaurs, and various other reptiles, each adapted to particular feeding heights, bite forces, and digestive strategies. Amphibians, especially large temnospondyls, remain influential in aquatic systems, preying on fish and smaller tetrapods, while fishes and invertebrates occupy primary consumer levels in lakes and rivers. Climatic factors such as temperature and water availability further structure these relationships. In hotter, drier, low latitudes, vertebrate assemblages tend to include drought-tolerant taxa, with physiological or behavioral traits that allow them to cope with high temperatures and seasonal water scarcity, and these environments often emphasize pseudosuchian-dominated faunas with fewer dinosaurs and large synapsids. In more humid mid-latitude belts, and in highlands or coastal regions with more reliable precipitation, mixed communities of archosaurs and synapsids can develop greater structural complexity with overlapping herbivore and predator assemblages and more continuous vegetation cover. Despite this diversification, the overall vulnerability of late Triassic ecosystems to climatic and environmental shifts remains high. Many of the dominant archosaur and synapsid clades occupy narrow climatic niches or depend on particular habitat types, and stratigraphic evidence shows that changes in humidity, temperature, or sedimentation can alter local community composition over relatively short timescales. Triassic archosaurs as a whole thus represent a radiation that fills available ecological space within a physically and biologically constrained world, where harsh climates, fragmented habitats, and uneven recovery from earlier crises limit the extent and stability of complex terrestrial ecosystems, even as new clades such as pterosaurs and dinosaurs appear and begin to diversify within the broader archosaur framework. In the middle and late Triassic synapsids and their close mammalia form, relatives live within plant communities that are now more structured than in the earliest Triassic, but still show uneven diversity and sensitivity to climate. On the plant side, most lowland and mid-elevation landscapes are covered by gymnosperm-dominated floras in which conifers form much of the upper canopy seed. Ferns, cycads, and ginkgophytes occupy intermediate layers, and ferns, sphenophytes, and lycophytes dominate the understory. In Gondwana, the characteristic dicroidium flora built around seed ferns with distinctive bifurcating fronds replaces the Permian glossopteris forests and persists through much of the Triassic. In Laurasia, a somewhat different mix of conifers, seed ferns, and other gymnosperms produces broadly similar multi-story vegetation. Across both hemispheres, these plant assemblages vary with climate and topography. In more humid belts along some Tethyan margins and in high-latitude regions such as Triassic Antarctica, dense forests with conifer and seed fern canopies develop along rivers and on low uplands with rich understories of ferns and horsetails in wet depressions. In semi-arid interiors and leeward basins, drought-tolerant conifers, seed ferns, and shrubby gymnosperms form more open woodlands and scrub interspersed with bare ground and low herb cover. The plants provide food in the form of leaves, stems, seeds, and reproductive structures, and they create physical structure that defines microhabitats in soils, litter layers, and undergrowth. Non-mammaliform cynodonts, a subgroup of synapsids, are prominent terrestrial vertebrates within these plant worlds. They are especially diverse in middle and late Triassic assemblages from southern Gondwana, including South America, Southern Africa and Antarctica, but they also occur in Laurasian faunas. Their diversity peaks in the middle to early late Triassic, and they occupy a broad range of ecological roles. Herbivorous or omnivorous traversodontid cynodonts are mid-sized animals with deep jaws and complex postcanine teeth that bear cusps and basins suitable for grinding plant material. Toothwear patterns and jaw mechanics indicate that they process fibrous plant tissues rather than swallowing food with minimal oral processing. These animals likely feed on leaves and stems from understory plants and low branches of conifers and seed ferns, as well as on roots and seeds, where available, though precise diets are reconstructed from tooth morphology and associated plant fossils rather than direct gut contents. Their distribution closely tracks that of well-vegetated floodplains and uplands, and in several basins traversodontids are among the most common tetrapods in Middle and Late Triassic assemblages. Alongside these herbivores, Probenognaathian cynodonts make up a diverse suite of small to medium carnivorous and insectivorous forms. They possess more slender jaws, differentiated teeth with sharp cusps, suited to slicing flesh and crushing arthropod exoskeletons and cranial features that foreshadow the mammalian jaw joint and middle ear. Osteological and histological data suggest relatively high growth rates and active lifestyles compared with many Paleozoic synapsids, although the exact metabolic levels remain debated. These Probenognaathians hunt invertebrates and small vertebrates on forest floors in leaf litter and along river margins, and they also scavenge carcasses where available. Their abundance and range of morphologies in Middle and Late Triassic faunas indicate that they fill many of the small predator and omnivore niches in ecosystems where large archosaurian predators dominate higher trophic levels. Large herbivorous synapsids persist into the Late Triassic as well. Canamyra-formed dicynodonts such as Placerius represent robust barrel-bodied herbivores with tusks and beak-like jaws that crop vegetation in floodplain and lowland settings. They inhabit regions with sufficient plant biomass and reliable water, and are often preserved in fluvial deposits associated with channels and overbank facies. Their presence, together with that of traversodontids and large herbivorous archosaurs such as etosaurs and early sauropodomorph dinosaurs, shows that late Triassic herbivore guilds are taxonomically mixed with synapsids and archosaurs, sharing access to conifer and seed fern-dominated vegetation. Toward the smaller end of the body size spectrum, the first mammalia forms appear in the late Triassic as descendants of Probenognaathian cynodonts. Fossils such as Adelobasileus from late Triassic strata in western North America, together with Morganocodontan material from late Triassic deposits in Europe and other regions, document animals that combine mammalian jaw and tooth characteristics with overall small body size. They have tooth rows with differentiated incisors, canines, premolar-like and molar-like teeth including complex molar crowns, and their lower jaws approach the mammalian condition in which a single bone bears the teeth and articulates with the skull. Although many specimens are isolated jaws and teeth, these features indicate that late Triassic mammalia forms are small animals with precise occlusion and rapid chewing cycles that feed largely on invertebrates and other small prey. Their skeletons are not completely known for all taxa, but available evidence supports agile locomotion, and the capacity for sustained activity and bone microstructure is consistent with relatively elevated metabolic rates. Because direct indicators of soft tissues and behavior are sparse aspects such as fur presence, detailed thermoregulatory strategies and daily activity patterns remain inferred from phylogenetic position and from comparison with closely related forms rather than directly observed, and these inferences retain some uncertainty. Within Triassic plant communities, these mammalia forms and their cynodont relatives occupy mainly understory litter and burrow-associated niches. They move through horizontal roots, fallen branches, and low vegetation, where they encounter insects, other arthropods, and small vertebrates associated with decaying plant material and moist microhabitats. In forested belts with multi-layered vegetation, they use vertical structure at scales appropriate to their size, for example, exploring shrubs, low trunks and root buttresses, while large synapsids and archosaurs exploit canopy and open ground resources. In more open woodlands and semi-arid scrub, probenognathans and mammalia forms use burrows and rock crevices for shelter and for moderating exposure to temperature extremes, and predators tying their ecology closely to soil properties and the presence of stable substrates. The plant world also shapes the distribution and persistence of synapsid lineages through its response to climate. In humid or moderately seasonal regions with conifer seed fern forests and well-developed soils, plant productivity supports herbivore and omnivore populations and provides complex habitat structure. In strongly seasonal or arid regions, vegetation becomes sparse and patchy, reducing food availability and increasing the distances animals must move between patches. Synapsids with higher metabolic demands and limited water conservation capacities experience particular constraints in these environments. Fossil assemblages show that many Middle and Late Triassic cynodonts, especially diverse probenognathan faunas, concentrate in regions interpretable as relatively well-watered floodplains, high-latitude forests or humid mid-latitude belts, whereas the driest low-latitude interiors host simpler vertebrate communities dominated by drought-tolerant archosaurs and a limited set of synapsid taxa. Hypotheses about the origin of endothermy in synapsids emphasize that Triassic cynodonts and early mammalia forms show bone histology consistent with rapid sustained growth upright or semi-upright limb postures that facilitate continuous locomotion and cranial features related to improved ventilation and sensory capacities. These traits, together with their small body sizes and insectivorous diets in mammalia forms, are consistent with the evolution of elevated metabolic rates in this clade during the Triassic, although the exact timing, extent, and ecological drivers of this shift remain under active study. In Triassic ecosystems, these physiological changes, if present, allow synapsids and their small descendants to exploit cooler microhabitats or activity windows less accessible to ectothermic competitors and predators, but direct fossil evidence for specific activity patterns is limited. Overall, the Middle and Late Triassic plant worlds dominated by conifers, seed ferns, and associated gymnosperms provide the structural and nutritional base for synapsid and early mammalia form lineages that persist and diversify alongside archosaurs. These lineages occupy roles as herbivores, omnivores, and small predators in forests, woodlands, and floodplains that remain subject to climatic stress, with their distributions and morphological trends closely linked to the availability and stability of vegetated habitats within a harsh and still fragile Triassic world. In the late Triassic open seas and on the broad shelves of the Tethys and Panthalassa marine ecosystems are fully structured with interacting levels of primary producers, invertebrate consumers, fishes, and large marine reptiles above benthic communities that have largely recovered from the earliest Triassic simplification. Seafloors on many low and middle latitude shelves carry mixed communities of bivalves, gastropods, echinoderms, and articulate brachiopods, together with patch reefs made of corals and sponges on suitable carbonate platforms. Microbialites are still present in some restricted or stressed settings, but on many open shelves metazoan skeletons now bind and baffle sediment, and three-dimensional frameworks of living and dead invertebrates provide habitat for small crustaceans, worms, and other benthic organisms. Bioturbation structures in late Triassic shelf sediments indicate active infaunal and epifaunal communities that are capable of mixing several tens of centimeters of substrate and trace fossil suites, show a range of behaviors, including dwelling, grazing, and feeding burrows. On slopes and in deeper basins, mudstones and siltstones contain more continuous records of benthic life than in many early Triassic successions, although intervals of reduced oxygen still occur in some restricted basins. In these deeper settings, benthic assemblages include small bivalves, thin-shelled brachiopods, and echinoderm ossicles, and the degree of bioturbation varies with local ventilation and organic matter flux. Above the seafloor, ammonoids and other nectonic invertebrates form a conspicuous and taxonomically rich component of late Triassic marine ecosystems. Ammonoids, which recovered rapidly after the end Permian extinction, reach high diversity and show marked provincial differentiation by the Middle and Late Triassic, with many lineages restricted to particular climatic belts or oceanic regions. Their shells display a wide range of geometries and ornamentation, from simple planispiral forms, with smooth flanks, to more strongly ribbed and tuberculate morphologies, reflecting both phylogenetic history and hydrodynamic constraints. Assemblages from late Triassic basins, such as those in the Alpine region, record numerous coexisting ammonoid species and associated coprolites and regurgitated masses produced by fishes and reptiles often contain fragmented ammonoid shells, showing that these cephalopods are important prey for higher trophic levels. Planktonic microfossils, including radiolarians in open ocean settings, form the base of many pelagic food webs and contribute silica to the sediment when they die and sink. Their assemblages gain in complexity and regional structure through the Triassic, indicating that plankton communities have diversified beyond the simplest post-extinction states. Large marine reptiles occupy the upper tiers of many late Triassic marine food webs. Ichthyosaurs, which begin as early pelagic predators in the early Triassic, reach high morphological disparity and large body size during the Triassic, and are well adapted to active swimming in open water. Their streamlined bodies, lunate tails, and limb fins with tightly packed elements support fast sustained locomotion, and skull and tooth morphologies range from long, slender snouts suited to capturing small fishes and cephalopods to robust jaws with enlarged teeth associated with macropredatory roles. Vertebrate assemblages from Middle and Late Triassic faunas show ichthyosaurs spanning a spectrum of body sizes from small coastal forms to very large open ocean taxa, and osteohistological data indicate rapid growth and active lifestyles. Coastal and shelf seas host additional marine reptile clades. Nothosauroids and other early sauropterygians use paddle-like limbs and laterally compressed tails to maneuver in nearshore waters. Some taxa feed on fishes and cephalopods in the water column, while others forage on benthic invertebrates. Placodonts inhabit shallow coastal zones and develop heavy tooth plates suited to crushing hard-shelled prey, such as bivalves and brachiopods, linking them directly to the structure of benthic communities on carbonate platforms and coastal shelves. Thalattosaurs and other regionally restricted groups inhabit certain Triassic basins and add further variety to the marine reptile assemblage. Overall, the Triassic interval hosts the highest known diversity of marine reptile groups, when entire clades that are later lost are taken into account, with some lineages restricted to Triassic time and others continuing into later periods. Fishes occupy multiple trophic levels beneath and alongside marine reptiles in these ecosystems. Cartilaginous fishes such as hybodont sharks are common in both marine and freshwater settings, and act as predators and scavengers on a variety of prey. ray-finned fishes, which began a major diversification in the early Triassic, reach high diversity in the middle Triassic, and maintain strong representation into the late Triassic. Assemblages include small to medium-sized forms that feed on plankton and small invertebrates, as well as larger predatory taxa, such as saurischids and related groups with elongate bodies and jaws. Some late Triassic fish coprolites and gut contents contain ammonoids and other nectonic prey, showing direct links between fish predation and cephalopod populations. Coelacanths and lungfishes also persist in marine and non-marine settings, although they contribute less to overall biomass than ray-finned fishes in many basins. Together with invertebrate zooplankton, these fish groups convert primary production into biomass at multiple intermediate trophic levels and serve as prey for larger reptiles and other predatory fishes. Open ocean and epicontinental seafood webs in the late Triassic can be described as having several vertically stacked tiers. At the base, phytoplankton and benthic algae convert dissolved nutrients and light into organic matter. Zooplankton, including crustaceans and small nectonic invertebrates, consume this primary production. Small fishes, juvenile ammonoids, and other invertebrates feed on the zooplankton and small benthic organisms. Larger fishes and ammonoids consume those smaller animals and in turn are preyed upon by marine reptiles, including medium and large ichthyosaurs and coastal sauropterygians. On some shelves, and in some basins, large temnospondyle amphibians contribute to predation in marginal marine and lagoonal settings, linking freshwater and marine food webs. The structure of these networks varies with water depth, distance from shore, and local environmental conditions, but in many regions the overall arrangement of trophic levels and the presence of active vertebrate top predators resemble patterns observed in many later Mesozoic marine ecosystems. Despite this apparent completeness, late Triassic marine food webs remain constrained by environmental factors. Oxygen levels in the water column are generally higher and more stable than in the earliest Triassic, but geochemical records and black shale intervals in some upper Triassic sequences show that oxygen poor conditions still develop in certain basins and depth ranges, especially in restricted settings, with strong stratification and high organic matter flux. In these zones, benthic diversity is reduced, and communities remain dominated by tolerant taxa. The distribution of carbonate platforms, reefs, and productive upwelling zones is patchy, and controlled by basin geometry and currents, so rich marine reptile and fish faunas cluster around particular margins and seaways where prey is abundant, while other sectors of Panthalassa remain relatively low in biomass. Some marine reptile groups are geographically restricted and depend on specific coastal configurations, and regional extinctions of these lineages occur where local conditions change. Across the late Triassic oceans, the interaction of diverse ammonoids, fishes, and large marine reptiles with complex benthic and planktonic communities indicates that many key components of modern-type marine ecosystems are in place, but the persistence and distribution of these systems still reflect the underlying Triassic pattern of environmental instability, regional unevenness, and clades that remain confined to certain habitats and climatic zones within a harsh and sometimes fragile marine world. In the late Triassic, dinosaurs are one branch within the wider radiation of archosaurs, and they occupy a set of ecological roles that is significant but still limited compared with the full range of vertebrates on land. In formal terms, dinosaurs are avimeter-Thessalian archosaurs, characterized by an upright posture in which the hind limbs are held directly beneath the body and by specific features of the hip, ankle, and skull. The oldest unequivocal dinosaur body fossils come from late Carnian rocks of southern Pangaea, particularly extensional basins in what is now northwestern Argentina and southern Brazil. These basins, including the Ixigualasto and Santa Maria formations, preserve river-dominated floodplain successions with sandstones, mudstones, tuffs, and paleosols that record cool to warm temperatures and strongly seasonal rainfall, rather than extreme desert conditions. Within these successions, dinosaur remains occur alongside those of non-dinosaurian archosaurs, synapsids, and amphibians, indicating that early dinosaurs arise in already complex communities rather than in ecological isolation. Stratigraphic and geochronological work on the Ixigualasto Formation shows that these dinosaur-bearing beds span several million years in the late Carnian to early Nourian, during which fluvial channels over bank deposits and volcanic ash layers alternate, reflecting repeated channel migration, floodplain development, and episodic volcanism under a monsoon-influenced climate. In this setting, small to medium-sized Saurischian dinosaurs, such as Herrerasaurus, Eoraptor, and Eodromeus, together with basal sauropodomorphs and other early forms, represent a modest fraction of the total tetrapod fauna. Quantitative analyses indicate that in these earliest dinosaur assemblages, non-dinosaurian archosaurs such as large Ruisuchians and pseudosuchians and synapsids still account for much of the biomass and diversity, and that dinosaurs are numerous only in certain horizons and localities. As time progresses into the late Carnian and Nourian, dinosaur fossils and trackways appear in a growing number of basins across Pangaea, including the Chinle group of Western North America rift successions in Europe and other South American and possibly Indian formations. These records show that dinosaurs disperse from their initial southern Pangaean centers into central and northern regions, but their distribution is uneven. Some of the best studied faunas in Western North America, for example in the Chinle group, come from red bed floodplain settings with large river systems, ephemeral lakes and soils that experience alternating wet and dry seasons under an overall semi-arid climate. In these assemblages, small theropod dinosaurs and early sauropodomorphs occur among a fauna still dominated by phytosaurs, etosaurs, Ruisuchians, metapasaurid temnospondyls and dicynodonts. Footprint assemblages from central Pangaea confirm that small to medium bipedal dinosaurs are present in these dry low-latitude environments, but the same trackway horizons also contain abundant tracks of non-dinosaurian archosaurs and other tetrapods, reinforcing the picture that dinosaurs are one component of multi-species vertebrate communities. The main dinosaur lineages present in the late Triassic include theropods, sauropodomorphs, and possibly early ornithischians, although the affinities of some small herbivorous forms remain under debate. In the carnivorous guild, Herrerasaurids such as Herrerasaurus and related taxa represent early saurischians with features that place them near the base of theropod evolution. They are medium-sized bipeds with deep jaws and recurved teeth, well suited to active predation on other vertebrates. In some South American assemblages, Herrerasaurids may function as among the larger terrestrial predators, especially where giant Ruisuchians are absent or rare, but in many faunas, large crocodile-line archosaurs still occupy the top predator roles. Smaller theropod dinosaurs represented by forms such as Coelophysis and closely related taxa appear in Nourian strata of North America and elsewhere. These animals have lightweight skeletons, long hind limbs and grasping forelimbs, and they likely prey on small vertebrates and large invertebrates hunting along river margins and open floodplains. Their abundance in some Chinle group bone beds and track sites shows that by the Nourian small theropods are locally common, but their presence does not eliminate other small and mid-sized predators such as predatory cynodonts and early crocodilomorphs. Herbivorous dinosaurs in the late Triassic are dominated by early sauropodomorphs sometimes traditionally referred to as prosauropods. These include genera such as Plateosaurus in Europe and several forms in South American and Indian basins. Sauropodomorphs are medium to large-bodied animals with long necks and forelimbs of variable length, and their teeth and jaw mechanics indicate a mainly herbivorous diet, targeting foliage from shrubs and trees. Functional and climatic niche analyses show that late Triassic sauropodomorphs occupy a more restricted climatic space than many other tetrapods, and that they preferentially occur in relatively humid mid-latitude environments, rather than in the driest low-latitude interiors. This pattern is consistent with their need for reliable plant biomass and water, and it suggests that the global distribution of herbivorous dinosaurs is controlled as much by climate as by competition. In basins where climate allows more persistent forests and wetlands such as some European rift systems, and mid-latitude South American basins, sauropodomorphs are among the most common large herbivores, but in strongly arid regions dicynodonts, etosaurs and other reptiles may remain more prevalent. Evidence for early Ornithischian dinosaurs in the late Triassic is sparse and often contentious. Forms such as Pesanosaurus from the Esquigualasto Formation, and a few small-bodied herbivores or omnivores from other basins have been proposed as early members of the Ornithischian branch, but their exact phylogenetic positions remain under discussion. Regardless of their precise affiliations, small herbivorous dinosaurs in the late Triassic are rare compared with sauropodomorphs, and remain one element among other small herbivores and omnivores, including traversodontid cynodonts and small reptiles that feed on understory vegetation and seeds in forested and riparian settings. Across these environments, the early dinosaur radiation is shaped by the same climatic and environmental factors that influence other Triassic vertebrates. Climate models and sedimentary records show that late Triassic lowlands often experience hot temperatures, strong seasonality, and episodes of drought and flooding, with humidity increased only during certain intervals such as the Carnian humid episode. Statistical studies of dinosaur track and body fossil distributions indicate that during and after this humid interval, dinosaurs expand in range and abundance, especially in mid-latitude regions, but they remain largely absent or rare in the hottest interior deserts. Food web reconstructions and functional morphology studies suggest that dinosaurs do not simply replace existing herbivores and carnivores. Instead, they partition niche space with pseudosuchians and synapsids, taking advantage of upright posture, dynamic locomotion, and in some cases high growth rates to use particular parts of the landscape or activity patterns. At the same time, many late Triassic ecosystems remain dominated in absolute terms by crocodile line archosaurs in large predator and some herbivore roles, and by synapsids and other reptiles in many mid-level niches. In this context, the rise of dinosaurs in the late Triassic is best understood as a gradual increase in representation and ecological breadth within a harsh and still fragile world rather than as a sudden takeover. Dinosaurs first appear in river-dominated, seasonally wet floodplains of southern Pangaea, exploit climatic and environmental windows created by tectonically active basins and carbon cycle disturbances, and then spread unevenly across Pangaea, their distribution limited by temperature-water availability and the configuration of habitats. By the end of the Triassic, they are important but still regionally variable members of terrestrial communities, sharing landscapes with diverse archosaurs, synapsids, amphibians and invertebrates, on continents that remain unified as Pangaea, and subject to strong climatic gradients and environmental instability. Local, late Triassic dinosaur communities can be examined by focusing on a few well-studied basins, where sedimentary successions, plant remains, trace fossils and vertebrate skeletons together preserve detailed snapshots of habitats, food webs, and environmental rhythms. One example lies in the late Carnian to early Nourian Isigualasto formation of western Gondwana, where sandstones, mudstones, tuffs, and paleosols accumulate on a fluvial floodplain under cool temperate to warm strongly seasonal climates. Studies of paleosols and geochemical proxies indicate alternation between more humid intervals and phases of semi-arid conditions with pronounced wet and dry seasons, and large diameter burrows in overbank deposits point to vertebrates that use subsurface refuges during the driest times of year. Within this setting, the plant cover consists of gymnosperm-dominated assemblages, reconstructed from palynology and plant macrofossils including conifers, seed ferns and ferns, which form riparian vegetation along channels, and more open woodlands on better drained surfaces. Herbivore biomass is concentrated in a limited number of taxa, particularly the Rhynchosaur hyperodopedon and the large traversodontid Cynodont exeretodon, which appear in great numbers in certain biozones, with other synapsids and archosaurs present at lower abundances. Herrerasaurus. The most common dinosaur in the lower part of the formation, functions as a major terrestrial predator, feeding on these herbivores and on other vertebrates, while smaller dinosaurs such as Eoraptor and other early saurischians occupy additional carnivorous or omnivorous roles. Seasonal rivers that cross the floodplain create levees, crevasse splays, and floodplain ponds, and during wetter seasons these features concentrate water sediments and organic matter. In those intervals, plant growth is vigorous along channels and in low-lying areas, supporting grazing and browsing by rhynchosaurs and cynodonts, and providing cover for smaller animals. During dry seasons, falling water tables expose muds that crack and harden, and vegetation retreats to areas with deeper soils and residual moisture. Burrow systems in levee deposits attributed on anatomical grounds to small synapsids provide shelter from temperature extremes and water stress, and represent an important aspect of how vertebrates interact with the substrate in this harsh but productive environment. Daily rhythms within this community are inferred rather than directly observed. In a strongly seasonal climate with cool to mild mean temperatures, diurnal temperature ranges and light levels would permit large ectothermic reptiles such as some archosaurs to be active during daylight hours, when body temperatures can be regulated through basking and movement between microhabitats, while smaller endotherm like synapsids and mammalia forms can potentially extend activity into cooler parts of the day or night. Fossil evidence for specific activity patterns is limited, so such reconstructions rely on morphological and physiological inferences rather than direct data, but they remain consistent with the coexistence of large archosaurs and smaller, more active synapsids and early dinosaurs in the same floodplain. Over longer timescales, faunal successions in the Isigualasto formation show changes in the relative abundance of herbivores and carnivores, and in the composition of synapsid clades, but dinosaurs remain one component among rhynchosaurs, cynodonts, pseudoseuchians and amphibians within a community that remains sensitive to fluctuations in water availability and temperature. A second example comes from low-latitude Pangaean interiors, represented by the Chinle group of Western North America, where the Chinle Formation and related units record a semi-arid floodplain environment with meandering rivers, ephemeral lakes and playas across a broad back-arc basin. Sedimentological studies describe stacked packages of siltstones, mudstones and sandstones deposited by river systems that shift laterally across the basin, interspersed with lacustrine and palustrine faces that record temporary lakes and wetlands. Paleosols' evaporate horizons and red bed colours indicate hot temperatures, strong seasonality and frequent droughts, while local coal or organic-rich intervals and fine-grained lake deposits mark phases of higher effective moisture. Vegetation in this setting is concentrated along channels, floodplains and lake margins, where conifers and other gymnosperms seed ferns and ferns form woodlands and thickets, leaving much of the interfluve area more sparsely vegetated. Faunas in these successions include abundant phytosaurs, which are long-snouted semi-aquatic crocodile line archosaurs that occupy major predatory roles in rivers and lakes, preying on fishes, amphibians and terrestrial vertebrates that come to drink. Etosaurs, heavily armoured herbivorous pseudoseuchians, browse on low vegetation and disturb soils while foraging on floodplains. Large metoposaurid temnospondyle amphibians inhabit perennial or long-lived water bodies and function as additional aquatic predators. Small to medium theropod dinosaurs exemplified by taxa such as Quilophysis in some Norian units occupy agile predatory roles on land hunting small vertebrates and invertebrates along channel margins and within open woodland. Herbivore guilds include Dicynodont synapsids, where they persist, as well as etosaurs, and possibly early sauropodomorph dinosaurs in some mid-latitude segments of the Chinle system, though the driest parts of the basin appear to host faunas with fewer large herbivorous dinosaurs. On a daily scale, temperature and moisture gradients between shaded riparian corridors and exposed floodplains create microhabitats that different vertebrates use at different times. Aquatic predators such as phytosaurs and metoposaurs are constrained to channels and lakes but can use depth and water movement to moderate temperature and access prey. Terrestrial archosaurs and synapsids move between water sources and more open ground, and their trackways record the repeated use of certain routes. Seasonally, monsoon-like rainfall patterns fill lakes and wetlands during wet phases, connecting aquatic habitats and allowing breeding and dispersal of amphibians and fishes, while dry phases fragment water bodies into isolated pools or playas, concentrating organisms and increasing competition and predation pressure. Wildfire evidence in some Chinle deposits indicates that during dry seasons vegetation can burn temporarily, removing cover and altering plant community structure, before regrowth in following wet seasons. These disturbances, together with shifts in lake level and channel position, mean that local dinosaur archosaur and synapsid populations experience frequent changes in habitat configuration, and their distributions track the availability of water and vegetation within an overall semi-arid seasonally stressed environment. A third example comes from mid-latitude late Triassic basins of Central Europe, where Plateosaurus-dominated assemblages occur in floodplain and delta, plain deposits of formations such as the Trossingen and Klettgau units, and in brackish to freshwater fluvial-dominated plains near the Norian-Ratian boundary. Sedimentological studies show that these basins host low-gradient river systems and delta plains that prograde into shallow seaways with sandstones, mudstones, and occasional coals or organic-rich layers reflecting channels, levees, floodplain ponds, and marginal wetlands. Paleobotanical evidence points to conifer and seed, fern-dominated forests and woodlands under temperate but still seasonal climates with cool winters and warm summers, and no large ice sheets. In these settings, Plateosaurus, a medium to large sauropodomorph dinosaur, is the most common large herbivore in many bone beds, which often preserve numerous individuals of different sizes in limited areas. The taphonomy of these accumulations suggests that some may represent catastrophic mortality events in herds or repeated use of particular landscape features such as floodplain depressions or shallow water bodies by aggregations of animals. Co-occurring vertebrates include basal theropod dinosaurs such as Lelian sternus, which act as mid-sized predators, armored etosaurs that browse or root in low vegetation, and additional reptiles and synapsids in smaller numbers. In brackish to freshwater delta, plain sectors, fishes, amphibians, and invertebrates occupy channels and wetlands, linking aquatic and terrestrial food webs. The daily and seasonal rhythms of these communities take place in a climate that is milder and more humid than that of low-latitude interiors, but still strongly seasonal. During growing seasons, forests and woodlands produce abundant foliage, and large herbivores such as Plateosaurus can feed along river corridors and on floodplains, while remaining within reach of water. Trackways and bone bed distributions indicate that they move extensively across these landscapes, perhaps following resource gradients between lowland and slightly elevated areas, as soils dry or become waterlogged. Predators such as Lilian sternus likely track these movements, and their activity windows are influenced by temperature and light levels as in other archosaurs. During cooler or drier seasons, plant productivity declines, water levels fall, and dustier or frost-affected surfaces develop, reducing forage quality and increasing the risk associated with travel between patches. Local sea level changes and delta progradation alter the position of brackish and freshwater zones, so that over longer intervals the interface between marine-influenced and purely continental habitats migrates across the plains, changing the mix of aquatic and terrestrial resources accessible to dinosaurs and other vertebrates. Behavioral traits such as growth rates, bone histology, and locomotor anatomy suggest that sauropodomorphs and their predators are capable of sustained movement and relatively rapid juvenile growth, which can be advantageous in environments where resources shift seasonally and where mortality events can remove large numbers of individuals from local populations. Together, these three examples show late Triassic local dinosaur communities occupying seasonal floodplains, semi-arid interior basins, and temperate mid-latitude plains, each embedded within broader climatic and tectonic frameworks that control water vegetation and habitat structure. In all of them, dinosaurs share space with diverse crocodile-line archosaurs, synapsids, amphibians, fishes, and invertebrates, and their abundance and ecological roles depend on local combinations of climate substrate and plant cover. The environments remain harsh in the sense that water and nutrients are unevenly distributed and subject to strong seasonal and longer-term fluctuations, and fragile in the sense that community composition can shift when climate or sedimentation patterns change. Early dinosaurs in these settings represent an important but regionally variable part of terrestrial food webs, expanding in range and diversity within a world still constrained by extreme seasonality, limited refuges, and incomplete recovery from earlier crises.